Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
Straw Hat Luffy, The Black Fist by J.R.R. Toast. What if Luffy had never eaten the devil fruit Shanks had brought into the bar that day? What if he started sailing a little earlier than canon? How would his story be different? Would he be the same Luffy we know and love? One thing is for sure, Luffy and his friends are in for a wild adventure. Adios.
Back again with another one. I saw a comment from a guest on the last chapter and I just couldn't help but reply to it, so if you don't feel like reading the note on this one, just head into the chapter and I hope you enjoy it. In regards to the comment, I disagree with a lot that was said, but there were some parts that I could at least see where they were coming from. The whole Luffy not stealing and then stealing later in the story has a pretty simple explanation, emo. He wasn't a pirate yet, lol. TBH, I feel like he's been pretty constant in regards to his character, but maybe I'm crazy. Second, is using Fat Luffy solely for comic relief, and while I agree that I do use it for comic relief, it also makes sense within the confines of the story. We see Kid blow up just like Luffy in the Wano arc. So, I believe that particular trait doesn't only apply to him. Next up was Zoro, and I can kinda see this one, but I still don't really get the whole notion that he only fights or challenges swordsmen or women. As far as I'm aware, Kaku wasn't a swordsman, and I feel like there are others, but that might just be me looking for a way to explain myself, lol. The comment also mentioned Garp and the weak excuse for why he didn't know about Luffy's haky, and I'll give them this one, it wasn't great. But I thought it was good for the time being and left it open enough to build upon later. You'll notice I do that with a lot of things. It was mentioned that Sanji and Zoro missed out on moments that defined their characters and their reasons for becoming Straw Hats, but I feel like if you read the pre-canon arc, those things are there, they are just different. Zoro grew a ton during the pre-canon arc, and instead of Zoro being the one to push Sanji to chase his dream, it was Zeph. There was a whole conversation between the two of them, Zeph and Sanji. And I chose to try and highlight that versus go the canon route. I thought the thing about Luffy curb stomping people felt like an argument just to make one, lol. I explained haky exhaustion and the way it works in this story, and if you follow that reasoning, I feel like it's not that hard to see why he's so strong without haky. Lastly was the meetings with Robin and Jinbei, and I just can't help but disagree. Within the confines of the story, I feel like Robin fit with what was going on at the time. The second in command of a society of bounty hunters goes to recruit more bounty hunters. In Jinbei's case, I'll admit we probably see Hachi differently, as there was some background stuff for his character that didn't quite make it into the story, but I still feel like with the way things went it wasn't that much of a leap. After writing all this, I realize I probably have a pretty heavy author's bias, but still, I think I make some pretty good counterpoints. Or not. Who knows? Anyway, still, I want to say thanks for the comment. I enjoyed reading and responding to it. And don't think I forgot about the rest of you. I love all the attention this story gets, even if I don't respond to everything. Sorry for the rantiness, and I'll stop talking now. Enjoy the chapter. Chapter 47. Bounty heard around the world. A knock startled the man sitting at the cluttered room's main desk, and he looked up from the newspaper in his feathery hands. Come in. The door opened and a young journalist entered the room with a Den Den Mushi held at his side. It's for you, Mr. Morgan. He sighed, knowing the response he was about to receive. But the person on the other end of the line had been very adamant that they talk with him directly. It's Navy HQ. A scoff rose from the bird-like figure's yellow beak, and he stood from his desk, the many white feathers covering his body rustling as he made his way in his employee's direction. When the young man presented him with the Den Den Mushi, instead of taking it and answering the call, he hung up. The journalist groaned in exasperation. They're just gonna call again. Morgan grinned at the words, eyes finding the papers he'd been looking at sitting on his desk. Listen up, Jeffords. They've asked me to change that photo countless times since we drafted the newest posters, and I'll continue to refuse. The Navy had already refused the first photo he wanted to use, which he thought strange, but now it was happening a second time. And he was no fool. The albatross man turned back to his employee and excited laughter began to bubble from his chest, because that's usually how I know I've got something good. Before the young journalist could get in another word, he sprinted through the door with a certain destination in mind. I'm off for a little while, keep an eye on the place while I'm gone." Morgan's laughter echoed through the office as he made his way in the direction of the exit, and he shouted loud enough for everyone to hear his parting words. "The truth shall never be silenced. Jeffords, never." "You seen this yet, Makino?" the mayor of Fuchsia Village asked as he grouchily made his way through the doors to Party's bar, intently looking down at a yellowed piece of parchment in his hand. "Mr. Mayor," the woman exclaimed, setting down the glass she was cleaning, "you're not usually one for a midday drink." She glanced down at the paper he held, curiously, before pointing at it, "And if that's what you're referring to, no, I haven't seen it." The man sighed a sigh that showed his age and made his way over to the bar, setting the paper face up before he sat down at one of the stools. Makino immediately lit up at seeing the photo on the bounty poster, an excited squeal leaving her mouth when she snatched it up to get a closer look. "Luffy!" the barmaid exclaimed brightly, her eyes drifting to the words below the picture. When they found the price the Navy was offering for his head, they widened, her skin visibly paling. It was even higher than Ace's first bounty. The man across from her scoffed when she shook away her bewilderment, and a smile made its way back to her face, looking up to the picture once again. From the grin he was wearing, she could tell he was having fun, and that was all she could bring herself to care about. Without another word, the woman picked up Luffy's bounty poster and pinned it to the board behind her, right next to his brother's. She took a step back and couldn't help the small laugh that left her lips when she turned to find the mayor scowling at her. "Oh, can it, Mr. Mayor? They're basically family. I wasn't gonna not put it up there. Besides, you're the one who brought it in." "Vice Admiral Garp, sir, look," Kobe shouted excitedly, bursting into the man's office and brandishing the bounty poster he held in his hand. "It's Luffy." The graying man almost jumped out of his chair as he made to clear away the evidence of his afternoon snack. "Damn it, Kobe," Garp growled, slamming his uneaten rice cakes into one of the drawers at his desk. "Didn't I tell you to knock?" The pinkett paled at the look he was receiving from his mentor and immediately bent at the waist, desperately holding the parchment he'd arrived without in front of him. "I'm sorry, sir," he desperately yelled, "but, look, it's Luffy." He really didn't want a fist of love. The first time he'd gotten one he thought he'd died. The vice admiral's chair screeched across the floor when he stood and stomped in the pink-haired boy's direction, already reaching for the page in irritation. He met almost no resistance when he snatched it out of Kobe's grasp and examined it intently, a tick mark beginning to appear above his brow. Sengoku wasn't kidding. He'd earned himself a damn high first bounty. A loud sigh left Garp's lips and he handed the poster back to his student, turning to intently look out of the large window behind his chair. "Damn it, Luffy," however, even with the words, he couldn't help the small smile that rose to his lips. The Monkey D's really knew how to shake the world up. "Pops, take a look at this," Marco shouted as handed over the money for the paper and the latest bounty posters. He barely even heard the news. Cootie making his way over to his father's seat in the middle of the deck with his eyes locked to the page at the top of the stack. The massive old man watched his son approach with curiosity in his eyes. "What's got you pissing yourself, Marco?" "Look," the Phoenix man exclaimed, turning the bounty poster he was looking at so his captain could see. "It's Ace's little brother, the one he always talks about." Whitebeard examined the picture on the bounty poster closely and had to resist the urge to grin when his eyes roamed over the gray sheen covering the boy's fist. He grunted in amusement as he looked intently at the young man in the photo and the number below it. "Rookie Brad knows how to use haky, probably thinks he's hot shit." Hot shit or not, though, the Navy was bound to be all over him because of that picture. The large man's deep rolling laughter filled the deck when the image of a certain feathery journalist popped into his head. "Damn bastard, Morgan. Always trying to stir the pot." His laughter died down and his lips quirked up into a grin, eyes catching the photo of the young man once again. "Seems like things in paradise are about to get interesting." A pair of bright red eyes twinkled like diamonds in the sun as their owner gazed down at the piece of parchment in his hands with absolute reverence. Bartolomeo gulped loudly. He didn't know if he could handle it. It was too much. The green-haired man mumbled, "Mr. Luffy, he couldn't help it when water began to leak from the corners of his eyes. A wail pierced through the hideout, the streams running from his eyes turning to something closer to waterfalls. He's so damn cool." "Hey, Rio," Ren said, shyly tugging on the man's pants to get his attention. The mobster pulled his watery eyes away from his boss's crying form and wiped the tears from his cheeks, bending down to face the boy. What's up, Ren? He sniffled. Ren looked at the emotional man strangely before his eyes began to shift through the other members of the group, all of them seemingly crying the same as Ryo. Why is everyone crying? He asked innocently. As soon as the words left his mouth, silence consumed the space and he looked around nervously. Why had everyone gotten quiet all of a sudden? Ren, Bartolomeo said in a low voice. The boy whipped around and almost ran into Barto's figure standing directly behind him, green eyes meeting tear-stained red. When had he gotten there? He nervously watched the man's eyes shadow and couldn't help it when he took a small step backward. The men had been very kind to him since everything that had happened a few days ago, but he was getting scared. Why was Barto looking at him like that? Tell me, the mob boss whispered. Do you know the name of Straw Hat Luffy? Ren nervously looked around before shaking his head in the negative, taking another small step back. Without even a moment to brace himself, the entire room suddenly burst into cheers. Excitement spreading through the group surrounding him. His widened gaze darted around the high-fiving figures in confusion and he eventually looked back to their leader, his red eyes glowing like a pair of suns. He looked like he was about to pee his pants. All right, boys. Bartolomeo's voice sounded above the roar of his men. You know what that means. In response to his words, the mob boss's crew, plus the man himself, began to quickly move throughout the building, excitedly thinking about the scenes they wanted to show Ren and gathering what they would need for their performances. Reenactment night. I'm not giving you any more money, damn bird. Ace yelled while he tried to swat away the news coup angrily pecking at his shirtless chest. The best he could tell, it wanted a tip, and he wasn't having it. I already paid you, now leave me alone, he growled, reaching out to grab the bird by its beak. His opposite hand burst into flame and he licked his lips while he stared hungrily into the animal's eyes. Unless you want to be my dinner. The news coup seemed to take the threat to heart with the way it began to squawk in panic, and the pirate released it with a smirk, watching in satisfaction as it flew away as quickly as it could. He sighed and looked at the papers he'd paid for, sitting down on the floor of his small craft. He unfolded the stack and was almost immediately shocked to stillness when his eyes met a smiling figure he was very familiar with. Luffy? Ace exclaimed in bewilderment, eyes roaming over the rest of his brother's bounty poster. When they found the number at the bottom of the page, they widened. His first bounty was huge. He looked back up at the photo of his brother and almost immediately realized why. He shook his head, a large smile rising to his face. Luffy had tried to teach him and Sabo when they were kids, but he barely knew what he was doing himself. Moral of the story, they weren't successful. Before the fireman could think on things further, his eyes suddenly locked shut and he fell against the side of his small boat. Soft snores began to leave his mouth as his narcolepsy involuntarily shooed him into the realm of Morpheus, and a smile rose to his unconscious lips. Dreams of the past playing in the darkness of his mind. Mihawk scoffed at all the groaning men littering the beach as he stepped through the sand. At this point, he wasn't even surprised. It was a scene he'd been met with on many occasions. He shook his head and scanned the surrounding bodies until his eyes landed on a head of red hair, heart rate rising by a fraction. A smile began to make its way onto the warlord's face, the black blade on his back starting to vibrate ever so slightly. He let his feet carry him in the direction of the man he was seeking and stopped in front of his snoring figure. Just when he went to wake him with the clearance of his throat, however, someone beat him to the punch. Time to get up, Captain. Ben Beckman sighed, shouldering past the swordsman to nudge the red-haired man. Oh, stop it, you, Shanks mumbled in his sleep, a lewd smile coming to his face as he hugged his first mate's leg. You little minx. Just wake up, damn it. Ben ripped his leg from his captain's grasp and kicked his shoulder with a scowl, the man yelping at being forced into wakefulness. Damn it, Ben, the pirate captain hissed, rubbing his shoulder tenderly. I told you to stop doing that. The gray-haired man only scoffed at the words, nodding at their guest. We've got company, Captain. Shanks' attention was immediately grabbed by the person standing next to his first mate and his eyes brightened, the sleep falling from them in an instant. Haky! He exclaimed in excitement, jumping up from his place in the sand and rushing in the swordsman's direction. Mihawk growled as the man jumped at him, shifting so he collided with the beach at his back instead of him. I told you to stop calling me that, red-haired. The pirate captain pulled his head out of the sand and sent Mihawk a cheeky smile. And I said I wouldn't until you start calling me Shanks. He laughed at the scoff the swordsman sent him and stood back to his feet, brushing the sand from his clothes. So, what brings a warlord to my doorstep? He asked curiously. Mihawk wasn't usually one to show up without a reason. The swordsman recomposed himself with a deep breath and tossed a piece of rolled-up parchment in Shanks' direction, amber eyes meeting black as he caught it. I think you'll find some interest in that. The red-haired man caught the piece of paper and held Mihawk's stare for a moment before shrugging. He unrolled the parchment and his eyebrows seemingly disappeared into his hairline at seeing the photo taking up the majority of the page. Luffy, the pirate captain exclaimed excitedly, laughter once again beginning to leave his lips, and he's got quite the bounty too. His eyes roamed over the photo of the boy and they landed on his darkened fist, a smirk taking residence on his face hardening. He wasn't all that surprised. Luffy had good senses when it came to haky. Better than most. He'd been skeptical at first, but by the time he left him, he had a good feeling this would be how things panned out. The bounty picture was definitely a surprise and he felt like he probably had Morgan to thank for that one. Shanks shook his head and he flashed the paper to his first mate. Not bad for a first bounty, huh, Ben? The gray-haired man smiled widely at the young boy in the photo. Not bad at all, I'd say, Captain. The pirate captain grinned at the words and made to wake the rest of the crew. They didn't have time for sleeping. It was time to celebrate. Wake up, everyone. We're having a party. He yelled to the groggy forms spread throughout the sand. We gotta celebrate Luffy's first bounty. Mihawk watched a wave roll through the gathered forms and they all shouted in joy like they weren't asleep only moments ago. Excited chatter spreading through the multitude of men. Before they could get too excited he turned back in Shanks' direction, the beginnings of a smile rising to his lips. No, 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 the red-haired man said, waving his hands in front of his face while Luffy's bounty poster flapped in the wind. I know that look. The swordsman's mouth formed into a wide smile and it continued to grow, the vibrations emanating from his blade becoming even stronger. Oh, come on, Shanks. He grinned, it's only a duel. Sanji, portside. Nami yelled up to the galley, her eyes staying glued to the log pose attached to her wristband. She'd have to thank Usopp again for making it. She'd been getting really tired of holding it all the time. The needle straightened out and she looked back up to the galley with a sigh. That's good, thanks, Sanji. They'd only just entered the Grand Line a few days ago and it was already the most insane sea she'd ever tried to sail. It made absolutely no sense. Anything for you, Nami, the blonde exclaimed, twirling his way out of the galley and down the steps. He bowed to the navigator and presented her with the drink she'd requested earlier, your tangerine juice. The orangeette smiled and lifted the glass from the platter. Thanks, Sanji. Sanji stood from his bow and winked at her before turning to where Zoro was lifting weights. His eyes caught the two figures sitting against the railing while they looked at the swordsman as if he were some kind of freak and he resisted the urge to laugh. To be fair, he was lifting quite a lot. He shook his head and made his way over. Memories shifting back to their entrance to the Grand Line and meeting their two prisoners. Guys, that's not a mountain. Usopp desperately screamed to his friends down below. That's a whale. The foghorn-like sound came again as the Mary began to pick up speed and the ship's deck erupted into panic at the looming threat of a mountain-sized whale. We've gotta slow down somehow, otherwise we're gonna crash straight into it, Nami yelled in panic. She scrambled to think of something but came up empty. Gaze locked on the largest animal she'd ever seen. It was even bigger than the wolf on East Lodestone. Luffy untangled himself from the figurehead and immediately rose to sprint toward the back of their vessel, rushing past his crew to address the large sea monster chasing the Mary from behind. Levi! He screamed down to the water. Meet me at the front right when we hit the bottom. He had an idea but he'd need his friend's help to make sure it worked without hurting the ship. Someone get on the whipstaff and steer us out of the way. The straw-hatted teen yelled down to his crew members still scrambling around the deck. And man the cannon just in case this doesn't work. Zoro and Sanji saluted their captain and immediately made to comply while Nami stared at him in bewilderment. It was the first time she'd ever heard him sound like a real captain. She was forced from her stupor when the Mary crashed against the water at the bottom of the mountain. the large red walls on either side of them disappearing behind splashing water. Her knees tried to buckle, but she somehow managed to stay on her feet and watched Luffy sprint toward the prow before launching himself over the railing and into the water. "Now, Levi!" the boy yelled as loud as he could while splashing into the ocean. Before he even had the time to turn around, wood slammed into his back and a multitude of bubbles floated from his mouth when he groaned. He was barely able to turn with the weight of the rushing water pushing him against the ship, but he managed it just as Levi sped past. "Help me slow Mary down," Luffy screamed, his words coming out garbled from the surrounding liquid. However, it seemed his friend understood because he stopped in place and turned, pointing his snout at the approaching hull. Within a moment, the beast's head slammed into place next to his. Push! His hands gripped the wood of his precious vessel and he grit his teeth, legs bending so his soles faced the massive obstacle at their backs, growing larger with every second that passed. A muffled crack rolled through the sea along with a shockwave accompanying the extension of his legs, and the teen felt Mary's wood groan underneath his palms. The ship slowed considerably, but it still wasn't enough. They were still moving too fast. "Come on, Levi. Push," he grunted, bending his legs once again. This was why he needed Levi's help. He could push harder, but if he did, he risked cracking Mary's wood, and that was the last thing he wanted. The pirate captain's legs shot outward once more and another boom ripped through the water as the two attempted to slow down the speeding vessel. The ship jerked a second time and he took a glance over his shoulder before immediately turning back. "Just one more, Lev." The sound of a cannon firing and a bright explosion coming from up above interrupted his words, and Luffy almost lost his grip on the Mary when she jerked again, slowing almost to a halt. He removed his hands and immediately swam over to his large friend, wrapping his arms around the sea monster's muzzle. "Thanks, buddy." Without another word, he shot up to the surface and took a large breath of fresh air when he broke through. "We should be okay now, Luffy," Nami yelled down to the boy she could see floating in the water. In response, he shot out of the blue liquid and landed back on the deck, his starry eyes glued to the massive open eyeball of the whale they were now sailing by. The footsteps of the rest of the crew sounded behind them, and she turned to find two boys walking in their direction, Usopp sliding down from the crow's nest. Luffy pulled his eyes away from one of the coolest things he'd ever seen and looked past it, out to the vast open sea at its back. Excited laughter rose from his chest and he began to jump up and down, turning to gather his crew members in a tight hug. "We made it, guys. We're finally here." He went to say more but was interrupted by a pair of screams sounding into the air from somewhere far up above. The pirate captain let his friends go as they all looked upward, and it didn't take long for them to find the source of the noise. Hurtling in their direction were two screaming people, and all of them had the same exact thought. Just where the hell had they come from? The crew watched in curiosity as their screaming forms sailed through the air, and they all winced when the two clapped into the ocean. Two large splashes erupting around them. That couldn't have felt good. "Another one?" Usopp questioned, his sharp eyes catching a third falling form. He couldn't help but think this one had more control of themselves. Was he diving? The others looked up to where the long-nosed teen was pointing, and they followed the falling form until he disappeared into the ocean as well, the following splash much quieter and smaller than the previous two. In but a moment, the third figure burst through the surface of the water with the two others hanging over his shoulders. His EY, and they narrowed, a shiver shooting down the spines of every one of them. Guys?" Usopp nervously asked, eyes locked to the man getting closer at a shockingly quick pace considering the squirming bodies he was holding on to. "Is he swimming to war?" He was interrupted by two yelps, a yelp of his own leaving his mouth when two wet and groaning bodies landed on the deck in front of them. Luffy stared at the soaking figures for a moment while the rest of his crew readied for a fight. He went to approach, but his eyes widened when he heard his friend's loud roar, the beast bursting through the water. Just when he went to see what was going on, the sound stopped and was replaced by a deep purr. He cautiously stepped up to his place and looked down toward the water to see what the hell was going on, only for bewilderment to consume him. Levi looked like he was in heaven. An old man with what looked like a fan of feathers growing from his head sat in the water, scratching a spot under the beast's jaw, and his tongue hung out of the side of his mouth. Red eyes replaced with stark white as they rolled up into his head. "Please, help us," one of the groaning figures begged. "He just attacked us out of nowhere." Luffy turned back to the two strangers on the deck and to the one that had spoken. His eyes were met with a blue-haired woman holding her body in pain while she tried to sit up. Zoro and Nami looked at each other before both looking to Usopp and Sanji, all four nodding at once. Nami backed behind Zoro's shoulder as he pointed Kitetsu at the prone forms and Usopp loaded his slingshot, aiming it in their direction while Sanji's boot began to tap into the deck. Just when Luffy went to tell his crew members to settle down, a figure slamming into the deck at his side stopped him. His feet pushed off the wood and his fists came up in front of him, enhancement spreading across his skin. It only took a moment for his crew to respond to his actions, the group surrounding the old man in an instant. "I'd back off if I were you," the strange person said seriously, gaze meeting each of those surrounding him. Zoro drew Kaguya with a sweaty palm, now pointing both of his blades in the man's direction. "Oh yeah? And why's that? There was something about this guy." The man calmly turned his gaze to the swordsman and his eyes narrowed. "'Cause someone'll die." Sanji scowled and the tapping of his foot began to increase in speed. "And who might that be?" A tense silence followed the words before it was suddenly broken by the person the group had surrounded. "Why, me of course." The blonde shook his head at the memory of the man named Crocus. He'd been something, to say the least. He'd been awful interested in Luffy too for some reason. In his necklace over anything else. He'd actually even heard him say something kinda strange and he wasn't sure anyone else caught it. Strange that he should have both, Crocus mumbled to himself, peering intently down to the boy's necklace from his place still on the front deck. He felt a pair of eyes on him and his gaze locked to a pair of blue-gray orbs. He resisted the urge to smile at the blonde, quickly turning away and rose a finger to his lips, winking before the boy moved his attention elsewhere. Sanji still didn't know what to think about the words. He'd obviously been talking about the charms on Luffy's necklace, but his meaning had been lost on him. He wasn't even sure he should mention it. He shrugged his shoulders. He'd tell Luffy when he got the chance if he remembered. He'd probably be better off saying something rather than nothing. After they'd sorted everything out with Crocus, which took some time with all the conflicting stories, they'd come to the conclusion that he was telling the truth about the two being bounty hunters, along with everything else he mentioned. Then, the old man had been kind enough to offer them a meal, to which he'd ended up cooking, and they'd heard the sad tale of Laboon. They'd eaten, drank, and their captain even had a friendly sparring match with the massive whale. Somewhere along the way, Luffy had also managed to break the bounty hunter's only way of getting back home, apparently. That caused a whole slew of problems that ended with them begging for a ride to the next island, which also just happened to be their home, to which he'd agreed, probably just to stop them from being annoying in all honesty. Luffy had left Laboon with a symbol of their friendship in the form of a terribly drawn rendition of his Jolly Roger, and once Crocus explained the log pose to Nami, they gathered themselves up and made to sail in the direction of their first island, a place called Whiskey Peak if their guests were to be believed. Speaking of their guests, Sanji examined the pair and couldn't help the steam that blew from his nose when his eyes landed on the woman. She was beautiful. His earlier talk with the swordsman floated through his mind and he couldn't help but be grateful. It had helped him realize that as long as he was following what his heart told him to do, regardless of how it changed him, he would do it. The chef's heart had told him to defend Ren from that monstrosity and he shouldn't be ashamed of that even with what he'd had to do. If it came down to it in the future, he'd let his heart decide again and again because he knew he'd made the right decision, regardless of the consequences. It still hurt him, what he'd had to do, but, right now, his heart was telling him to pamper this stunning young lady, and that was exactly what he was going to do. "Is there anything I can get you, Ms. Wednesday, and what was your name again?" Sanji asked, crouching down in front of the two. Mr. Nine tore his eyes away from the green-haired gorilla lifting more than anyone he'd ever seen and looked to the blonde who'd addressed them. He told them his name like 10 times already. Why could none of them remember? His stomach growled and he looked down in embarrassment, finger drawing circles on the wood. "It's Mr. Nine." The chef laughed brightly. "I'll take that as a yes to both for you then." He turned back to the woman. "Anything for you, my lady?" Nami watched the happenings on the deck with a sigh, pulling her gaze away from the chef lightly chatting with their prisoners. Her only stipulation about bringing them along had been that a reward be given upon their arrival, to which they'd vehemently agreed. A little too vehemently, she shook her head and walked over to the side of the ship before calling down to the water. "Luffy, I need you and Levi to steer the boat for a little bit." The water of the ocean rumbled from somewhere far below and the orange sighed as she stepped away from the railing, the rumbles turning to muffled booms the closer they came to the surface. She covered her ears and didn't have to wait long before a crack echoed through the air, her captain's form sailing out of the water and straight into the sky. "In your face, Levi!" Luffy screamed in joy while he flipped through the air. He stilled himself so he faced the water once again, his wet clothing wildly rippling in the wind, and his legs snaked out behind him. "I totally won that time." Nami winced when another crack consumed the area and cautiously pulled her hands away from her ears, eyes amusedly watching her captain flash black down to the water. A massive splash erupted around his point of entry and she couldn't help but scoff slightly. Luffy was really something else. His laughter brought her out of her thoughts and she walked back to the railing, looking down to see Luffy play fighting with Levi in the water. Well, play fighting to them. Most people would have probably drowned in the amount of water they were throwing around. "Nami, I did it. I finally won," the straw-hatted teen exclaimed in joy, sending a massive wave of water in his friend's direction. An irritated-sounding rumble came from underneath him and he scoffed at the large beast. "Oh, shut it. You're just grumpy." The Oranget smiled at the interaction before nodding toward the prow. "I need you and Levi to steer for a little bit." Luffy looked up at his navigator incredulously, "But you said we wouldn't have to do that anymore. Plus, Levi says swimming here is like, totally weird." "I'll be there to help give directions. I promise it'll only be for a little while, everyone else is doing stuff," Nami countered. "And I can't sail the Mary all by myself." Actually, she could, but that was far too much work. She'd have asked Usopp to help but he was busy making ammo in preparation for their landing at Whiskey Peak. Plus, this gave her a good excuse to tan. The pirate captain huffed and nodded at his friend, stepping onto his snout, Finna. His body was lifted out of the water when Levi launched him toward the deck and he flipped over the railing, softly landing on his feet. "Neat yaw at the front, buddy," he called down to the water before making his way to the prow. "I'll be up there in a sec. I gotta go grab my chair." Nami waved over her shoulder, turning toward the storeroom. Just when she made to step in its direction, the flapping of wings stopped her and she looked up to find a news coup descending toward her. She watched it land on the side rail and shrugged to herself. She hadn't read the news in a while. Might be good to catch up on the happenings of the world. The Oranget reached into her shirt and pulled out the usual fee for the paper before stuffing it into the bird's brown satchel, holding her hand out expectantly. It only took a moment for the avian to drop the folded stack in her hand before it headed in the direction of wherever its next delivery was. She watched it fly for a moment before leaning against the rail and unfolding the papers. The first headline that met her eyes made them widen. An exclamation from the east blew. "Ramblings of a deluded child or signs of a king in the making." Nami went to read the article below but stopped when several other pieces of paper fell from the folds of the ones in her hands. Her eyes caught one of the pages and she immediately realized what they all were. They were bounty posters. Her gaze shifted over the photos on the posters as she bent to pick them up but she suddenly stopped, a gasp leaving her lips. "Luffy." "What's up, Nami?" the teen asked, turning to face the main deck. Hadn't she gone to go get a chair? What was she still doing out there? And what were all those papers? The Oranget dropped the other pages in her hands and reached to pick up the one with her captain's picture on it. She looked up from the poster and took a shaky breath. "Guys," she said, getting the attention of everyone present on the deck, "I think you might want to see this." Nami turned the poster for everyone to see and the first to catch on was the person in the photo, but the others soon followed. "Is that me?" Luffy questioned in bewilderment. It took him a moment but he eventually came to an understanding about the piece of paper his navigator was showing them. "Wait, that's like the flip of a switch." He was on his feet and rushing in the girl's direction with a huge smile on his face. "That's my bounty poster." As soon as he was close enough, he reached out and softly pulled the paper from Nami's grasp, looking at it in absolute awe. "Wanted, dead or alive, Straw Hat, Monkey D. Luffy, the Black Fist. Captain of the Straw Hat Pirates, 71 bots. 000. A wail of anguish came from Nami's lips and her head drooped in depression while she watched Luffy run to show Zoro and Sanji. "The Navy's gonna be all over us now." She was honestly baffled more than anything. Arlong's bounty had been 20 million. The girl groaned and picked her head up to walk into the storeroom. Her crewmates' excited shouts sounding into the air at her back. Being on this crew was going to make her start wrinkling early. Back with another one, finally. Lol. I probably rewrote this chapter from top to bottom like 4 or 5 times before I was happy with it, which is why it took so long. I hate to keep you guys waiting, but I really want to be happy with something before I put it out, so thank you all for patiently waiting. I saw a couple of comments I wanted to address, so as always, if you don't care you can go ahead and jump into the chapter. Happy reading. There was a mention of Luffy's bounty being higher, and the only real reason why it wasn't is because Robin's bounty is 79.000.000. I think my reasoning for this is because of Robin, at this moment in time, is still more of a threat to the world government than Luffy is. To simplify it, what happened during the Void Century becoming public versus the knowledge of haky becoming public. But I will say this, at first it was going to be around the number they mentioned, which was 85.000.000. I had a question about why Luffy has 2 names on his bounty, and, if I'm being honest, I just like the way it sounds. I definitely probably could have gone with Straw Hat Monkey D. Luffy or Monkey D. Luffy. The Black Fist. But I thought it just sounded better combined, lol. Another comment was about Zoro and Usopp not having bounties, and I really think I could have gone either way on this one, as Zoro and Usopp weren't really in the limelight after their bounty hunting stint. I will say, it does make sense and feel like I could have made that work, but I've got some other plans for them, so hopefully those pan out the way I want them to. Also, for those of you wanting to see Levi do some growing, I've got some ideas for that, so I'll try not to keep you waiting too long. As always, I really appreciate you guys sticking around with me, and I love all the support. I read each and every one of the comments, good or bad, so feel free to let me know what you think. Hopefully, I won't have as much trouble with this next chapter, lol. Hope you enjoy it. Chapter 48. Whiskey Peak. Whoa, Luffy yelled joyously, turning to his friends scattered throughout the deck. Guys, look at how big those cactuses are. He turned back and stared at their first destination in excitement, anticipation rising the closer they sailed. Don't see that every day. Zoro mused as he stepped up to the front deck, Nami, Usopp, and Sanji on his tail. He stopped behind where his captain was sitting and the others filed in beside him, the crew all gazing in wonder at the numerous cacti that could have been mistaken for mountains, they were so large. Usopp stared at the approaching island in shock. The Grand Line really is a crazy place. He shook his head and rubbed his finger underneath his long nose, a facade of confidence taking over his face. Nothing the brave Captain Usopp can't handle, though. Nami pulled her gaze away from their destination and looked at the boys skeptically, sweat dripping from her brow. He'd been sulking about Luffy's bounty until they caught sight of the island. He hadn't sounded very brave then. She went to comment but stopped herself when 2 loud thumps sounded from the starboard side of the ship. You have our thanks for seeing us safely back home, Ms. Wednesday announced as she stood on the railing next to her partner. You shall be hailed as heroes upon your arrival and will receive a reward fitting of the title. She looked back at the group gathered on the front deck and her eyes zeroed in on the captain of the pirate crew. Memories shifting back to only hours earlier. Levi! Look! Luffy screamed, rushing toward the prow of the Mary. He held the piece of paper in his hands out in front of him before leaping off the ship's wood and over its front railing, grinning at his friend's head poking out of the water down below. It's my bounty poster. Usopp watched his captain disappear from his vision with his mouth still glued to the floor. He was so shocked that he didn't even realize he hadn't heard the splash that should have accompanied his disappearance. 71 million? Aren't you glad you went bounty hunting with us now, Usopp? Zoro chuckled, walking over to throw his arm around the sweating boy's shoulders. I told you we'd need to be strong. He shifted his gaze to the other 2 and grinned in their directions. He did say we'd be turning this world upside down after all. Ms. Wednesday eyed the group in shock. That couldn't be right? She looked over at her partner and wasn't surprised to see a similar look of disbelief plastered across his face. He obviously couldn't believe it either. 71 million? She turned back to the front of the ship when laughter consumed the air and watched the group's captain excitedly land back on the deck. Just who exactly was he? As the blue-haired woman watched the pirate crew begin to converse once again, she couldn't help but wonder who she and her partner had gotten themselves mixed up with. She shook the thought away and nudged the man still looking wide-eyed at the excited group. We need to make sure we get to back before they make it to Whiskey Peak. If they could somehow cash that bounty, it would be a surefire way of moving up through the ranks of Baroque works, and that was exactly what she needed at the moment, to make it up the ranks as quickly as possible. Mr. Nine immediately caught on to the meaning of the words and turned to face the woman at his side, looking at her incredulously. He knew what the usual protocol for newcomers was, but he turned back and looked at the group beginning to disperse. As nice as everyone had been, the last few days on this ship had made him very wary of their traveling companions. The blue-haired woman shook the memory away and nodded to the man at her side, turning to jump into the ocean. They needed to prepare everybody on Whiskey Peak for the jackpot that was rolling their way in the form of this pirate crew. However, just before the soles of her feet pushed from the wood, the two were roughly pulled back down to the deck by their collars, yelps leaving both of their mouths. The sounds of the bounty hunters' backs smacking into the floorboards were followed by loud groans, and they both slowly sat up while tenderly rubbing at their bruised skin. They looked at each other for a moment in confusion when they righted themselves before turning to find the captain of the ship they'd been traveling on standing directly in front of them. "No heroes," Luffy stated, looking down at the pair from behind the shadow of his straw hat. "We're pirates." He stepped between the two and let the light hit his eyes once again, lifting the bounty hunters by their coats and easily setting them back on their feet. "Got it." The pirate captain smirked at the shaking figures before lightly patting them both on the shoulder and stepping back toward the front deck. If he wanted to be a hero, he would have listened to Gramps and joined the Marines. He shook the thought away with a shiver. That sounded terrible. Sanji watched the woman and her partner take a moment to gather themselves from over his captain's shoulder before addressing the boy himself. Nodding to the two now shakily stepping back up on the railing. "Just gonna let him go?" He couldn't help but be slightly disappointed at the thought. Even with everything that had happened back in Lougetown, he'd enjoyed spending time with the beautiful Ms. Wednesday and was sad to see their time together come to an end. He couldn't care less about the other guy, he didn't even remember his name. Luffy chuckled at the question, making his way up the stairs back to the front deck. Just when he went to reply, an orange blur rushed past him and he was almost blown off his feet, just barely catching himself on the railing. Before he could even turn, two screams burst into the air along with the greedy voice of his navigator. "Nope, is this really necessary?" Ms. Wednesday asked in exasperation. She was trying her best to hide the panic rising through her. This was not how she'd planned on things going. The woman's wrists behind her back and clapped her hands together at a job well done. "You were the one that tried to leave." She turned Ms. Wednesday toward her and sent the other girl a smirk. "Besides, you heard the captain. We're no heroes." She winked in her direction before turning away and stepping back up to the front deck. "All right, boys," the orange had said, looking over Luffy's shoulder at the quickly approaching island. She looked at her crewmates gathering behind her before turning back to her captain. "I don't know what to expect when we land. So, what's the plan, Luffy?" The straw-hatted teen looked at the orange-haired girl and sent her a wide smile. "The plan is no plan." Laughter broke through his lips at the groan that left his navigator's mouth, and he turned back to the island as they drifted ever closer to their destination. He had no idea what to expect when they landed, and that just made it that much more exciting. He went to say more but stopped himself when he caught signs of a large crowd gathered around the area where they would more than likely be docking. "Looks like we might be in for a fight, Captain," Zoro said, his eyes finding the crowd the other boy was staring at. With the ever-decreasing distance between them, he began to hear the dull roar of the people surrounding the docks, and a grin matching the one the boy next to him wore rose to his face, the three katanas at his side beginning to vibrate ever so slightly. Usopp gulped loudly and couldn't help but think the Verde may have been right. That was a lot of people, and, the closer they sailed, the more agitated they seemed to become. He shook his head and let a fair amount of false bravado seep into his voice as he cleared his throat. "I think someone should stay behind to watch our precious vessel and, because of its importance, I will volunteer to take on this duty." He wasn't scared, he just couldn't tell if the people gathered at the docks were angry or happy, and it was making him slightly nervous. Who the heck would be happy to see pirates? "Nope," Luffy exclaimed, jumping up from his place and rushing over to the railing where their prisoners were still standing. "That's Levi's job." He leaned over the side of the ship and gripped the wood in anticipation. "Besides, you gotta come have fun with us, Usopp. It's our first island on the Grand Line." Sanji laughed when the sniper began to scramble for another excuse. "Oh, come on, Long Barrel. I thought you used to be some big shot bounty hunter. Don't tell me you're scared," he lightly teased, more laughter leaving his lips when the sniper's head immediately shot back up with steam shooting from his nostrils. Usopp's back straightened and he crossed his arms in front of his body, taking the most confident pose he could. However, just before he went to respond, the dull roar of the crowd at the docks suddenly began to grow louder and the two turned to look over the side of the ship. In the light of the setting sun, what met their vision was a shadowed crowd that looked like they were in the midst of preparing an attack on the incoming vessel, or maybe not. Nami was broken from her stupor when she realized that they would need to dock and ignored the ever-increasing volume of the people watching their approach. "Levi, can you stop us when we make it in?" A rumble she couldn't understand the meaning of came from somewhere under the water and she turned to her captain expectantly. He said yes. Luffy smiled, eyes drifting back to the boisterous crowd awaiting their arrival. It was strange, the closer they got, the people began to seem less angry and more excited. Ms. Wednesday eyed what she knew was the town preparing for their usual greeting and turned to the girl who'd tired her and her partner up as the ship slowly drifted to a stop. "I promise there's no need for these." "Welcome," a loud voice interrupted from the ground below. Everyone on the Mary looked down to the dock to find a man with very strangely styled long blonde hair standing in front of the gathered crowd. And, now that they were closer, they realized the people looked like they were getting ready for a party. "What the hell?" Zoro said quietly, his incredulous eyes shifting through the multitude of forms. His gaze narrowed and drifted back to the strange-looking man who'd addressed them, hand never leaving the still vibrating handle of his red-sheathed blade. Something smelled off. He glanced over at Nami, catching her eye, and could tell she was thinking along similar lines. Shaking his head to look back at the man making to speak once again. "My name is Igarappoi, the mayor of this town, and we here at Whiskey Peak would like to congratulate you on your entrance to the Grand Line, as it's no easy feat," the blonde man exclaimed, eyes shifting through the occupants of the lamb-headed ship. He met the gaze of a familiar woman and paled when he realized that she and her partner both had their hands tied behind their backs, scrambling momentarily before finding himself once again. "I see you've already met some of our people and I would like to kindly ask that you release them so the festivities may begin." Ms. Wednesday watched the forms around her and Mr. Nine anxiously while they looked at each other with skeptical eyes. Why did it feel like things wouldn't be that easy? "If you wouldn't mind me asking," Nami interjected before any of those on the deck could respond, "how long does it take for the log post to set here?" If she was being honest, she didn't like the thought of staying on this island for very long. Something about the whole atmosphere just felt off. The mayor of the town waved the question away with a dismissing laugh. "Oh, come now. There's no need for that. You've only just arrived," he exclaimed, motioning to the large crowd at his back. "These people have prepared a glorious party for you and I feel like it'd be a shame to let it go to waste. So, if you'll please release those two, the festivities can get underway." The words seemed strange to the ears of the pirates looking down on the dock from the deck of their ship. However, before any of them could get a word in, their captain's excited voice pierced through the air and each of them groaned internally. "Party?" As Ms. Wednesday sat at a table in the center of a crowded room watching her orange-haired jailer and the girl's green-haired friend drink her compatriots under the table, she couldn't help but think one thing: how the hell had it been so easy? Almost immediately after the mention of a party, the captain of the pirate crew that had captured them had practically dive-bombed into the crowd while everyone else watched on in bewilderment. It hadn't taken the rest of the boys' friends long to join in, however. The woman had tried to reason with the Orangeite about releasing her, along with the man who'd greeted them upon their entrance who she knew to be Mr. 8, but nothing they'd said even seemed to reach the girl's ears. She just kept repeating the same thing every time they tried to convince her that there was no need for the bindings, money first. The thought made Ms. Wednesday want to groan in irritation as she looked over at the hanging head of her partner still bound beside her. Hopefully, with the direction things were moving, they'd be able to free themselves soon. Her eyes drifted back to the table where the orange-haired girl and her crewmate sat and she jumped slightly when they both slammed another mug onto the table. "That makes 20 each," Nami yelled with little more than a light dusting of red covering her cheeks, throwing her hand up to high-five the boy next to her. Zoro burped loudly and smacked the girl's palm with his own in camaraderie, smirking at the man next to them laying face down in his own vomit. He snatched up another mug much more deftly than someone 20 deep should have been able to and stood from his place at the table, raising it into the air. "I told you I'd never lose again, Luffy," he yelled, Ove voices filling the space. The words went unnoticed as a leg of chicken disappeared into Luffy's mouth, his hands shooting out left and right to grab various food items from the feast set out in front of him. He was in heaven. These people just kept bringing him food and he was loving every second of it. The Grand Line was the best. He hoped every island was like this one. His hands continued to dart out while he kept eating, completely unaware of the panicked chefs in the kitchen running out of food at a frightening pace. Another woman sat at the table across from Nami and Zoro, dressed in the garb of a nun, and couldn't help but gape at the multitude of empty mugs littering the table. What the hell were these two? The dark-skinned woman wiped her bewilderment away and a smile replaced the jaw-dropped expression she was wearing as she stood and motioned to the kitchen. "Two more for these two. They're unstoppable." There I was, all alone and the only defense against the pirates' invasion of my home, but I stood my ground, Usopp dramatically shouted to the crowd surrounding him, hand clenching into a fist, because the great Captain Usopp never falters in the face of overwhelming odds. Sanji sat in the middle of a group of women as they listened to the long-nosed teen tell his stories and he couldn't help but sigh in bliss. The black-haired woman next to him leaned into his side and he shivered slightly at her touch, the momentary vision of a scarred face and a pair of grinning ruby-red lips entering his mind. He breathed deeply and pushed the thoughts away, looking down at the top of the woman's head with a rueful smile. He was definitely different now. This kind of contact from someone of the opposite sex would have usually sent him to the moon. The blonde was pulled out of his thoughts when he felt a weight on his other side and his smile turned more genuine as he relaxed into the soft embraces he was held in. Even though he was different, like Mosshead had said, he was still the same. Time passed in the blink of an eye while the celebration continued through the night and to the wee hours of the morning, many more stories told, many more drinks had, many more women talked to, and much more food eaten. The Straw Hat Pirates accepted the generosity of their welcome without batting an eye and partied to their heart's content until each and every one of them could party no more, or so it seemed. Ms. Wednesday looked around the wrecked space incredulously, her eyes landing on each of the passed-out pirates scattered throughout the room. Sweat dripped from her brow when she glanced at the groaning people of Whiskey Peak beginning to gather themselves together. These pirates had literally probably just run them dry, if they didn't manage to cash the bounty on this Straw Hat Luffy. They were looking at some seriously hard times ahead. The blue-haired girl turned away and nudged her shell-shocked partner, the man seemingly just barely able to pull his eyes away from the two pirates passed out at their table. "Let's get out of these ropes. M's Monday already left and I think Mr. 8 is waiting for us outside with her." She eyed her surroundings and her gaze eventually landed on a small knife on the next table over, quietly moving through unconscious bodies to make use of it. It took a moment for the words to register, bewilderment still clearly on his face, but Mr. 9 eventually shook his shock away and nodded, quietly standing from his chair as to not rouse the sleeping figures at the table with them. He still could barely believe the two were alive. That was an absurd amount of alcohol, plus the sleeping medicine. He was pulled out of his thoughts when he heard a quiet thump at his feet and looked over to find his partner rubbing her wrists uncomfortably. "Damn, those were tight." Ms. Wednesday scowled, eyeing the person to blame for her red wrists before turning and quickly cutting the rope keeping her partner's hands held behind his back. The thick cord fell to the ground and the man rubbed his wrists tenderly, eyes still locked on the two at the table. Were these people even human? He turned and his gaze found their captain snoring loudly on the floor. Hadn't he been fat a couple of hours ago? He shook his head and turned back to the two at the table, his gaze landing on the katanas at the Verde's side where they were leaning against the table. They looked valuable. If they were going to cash the bounty on their captain, his crew would be arrested along with him, so he probably didn't need those, right? Mr. 9 steeled himself and stepped around the table as quietly as he could, stopping in front of the weapons in question. He took one more glance at the green-haired teen's snoring form before slowly reaching out toward the swords. Just before his hand gripped the blade in the black sheath, a small growl coming from the swordsman's mouth made him jump in alarm and he immediately backed away in panic, sighing in relief when he realized the sound had once again been replaced by soft snoring. Maybe it was best if he left those alone. A quiet whistle caught the man's attention and he looked up to find his partner motioning for him to follow her out of the door along with everyone else who wasn't currently sleeping. He stood still while the others began to file out of the room behind the woman and took one last nervous glance at the Verde before following the others through the exit. Surely he wasn't still awake somehow, right? The sound of the door clicking shut behind the man sent a rousing through two of the forms still remaining in the room, and a pair of black eyes snapped open, its owner lifting his head off the table to glance around the space. He immediately met Nami's gaze as she rose alongside him and nodded in her direction. "Can't say I didn't see this one coming." He sighed, making to quietly stand from his chair and stretch his muscles. A similar sound left the orange-haired girl's mouth when she stood alongside him and she watched him slide his swords into his belt. "You and me both." She turned to look at their other three friends when the swordsman stepped away and debated whether to rouse them from their slumber, but, before she came to a decision, it was made for her. "Let them sleep." Zoro provided from his place now by the window. "I think we can probably handle things ourselves." He cautiously glanced through the dirty glass, finding that it led into an empty alleyway, and smirked to himself before turning back to the orangehead already searching the room for anything that looked valuable. He softly cleared his throat and nodded at the window when the girl looked his way. "I'm gonna see what's going on outside. You do whatever it is you do." Nami had to resist the urge to scoff and nodded her confirmation, watching the swordsman climb through the window while, surprisingly, not making too much noise in the process. As soon as his green hair disappeared from her vision, she was immediately back on the prowl. Almost immediately, she caught sight of the jewels hanging from the cord around her captain's neck and had to remind herself that she'd already gone down that road once. But, maybe, she quickly shook the thoughts away and looked back toward the window Zoro had exited out of, glancing around the room one last time. There was probably nothing of any real value left in there, so she might as well follow him. The orangehead shrugged to herself and made her way to the window, looking at her friends one more time before quietly making her way through the open pane of glass with a cat-like grin rising to her face. She was about to rob these people blind. "Listen, I'm telling you we need to be careful with these people," Ms. Wednesday cautioned from her place in the circle of gathered individuals. The group sat just outside the building the people in question currently resided in the center of the dirt street, and besides Ms. Wednesday herself, her partner, and Mr. 8, the proclaimed mayor of was one other. The person was obviously female but without the nun robes covering the rest of her body. The large muscles covered by her ebony skin made her look far more masculine than any of the others standing in the circle, including the men. "Look, Ms. Wednesday, we've got over 100 of ours here," the massive pink-haired woman argued, scoffing at the idea that the sleeping pirates could prove to be a threat. "You really think they could get through all of us? While they're asleep? Not to mention, we watched two of them drink more alcohol than anyone I've ever seen?" Red rose to the blue-haired girl's cheeks and she stumbled over her next words. I'm just saying, their captain has the largest bounty to ever come through here and I think we should be wary." She went to mention some of the things she'd witnessed while riding on their ship but stopped herself, unsure if she would even be believed. She looked over to her partner looking for some sort of assist but found him staring back at the door to the building instead of paying attention to the current conversation. "Ms. Wednesday is right," Mr. 8 said in support of the words, ruffling through the inside of his coat to pull out a yellowed piece of parchment. He held it in front of him and unrolled it so the taller woman could read it. Ms. Monday gaped at the bounty poster, her eyes drifting back to the door where a literal jackpot lay sleeping without a care in the world. "Holy shit, 71 million? That brat?" Ms. Wednesday turned back to the woman with sweat dripping over her brow. She was only now realizing that it was probably the first time Ms. Monday had heard that particular bit of information considering she and her partner had been held prisoner all night. "Ms. Wednesday, Mr. 9. Igaropoy said, grabbing the two's attention and rolling the paper up to stick back in his jacket pocket. "You two should go write up a report on all that's happened since you left and send it off to the boss. The unluckies should either already be here or will arrive soon, so once you're finished leave it in their mailbox." He turned to address the only other woman in the group when they nodded their confirmation and sped off in the opposite direction. "While they're doing that, Ms. Monday, I think you and I should begin securing our prize." "Sorry, but," a voice from somewhere above called down to the two who remained behind with the rest of the people there. "Would you mind letting them sleep a while longer?" The sound of a sword being drawn from a sheath filled the air and silver steel glinted in the moonlight above the figure's head, They're tired from the long voyage. Plus, a wide grin rose to their lips. I got an itch to scratch and this seems like the perfect opportunity. The two spun toward the voice in alarm, immediately readying themselves for a fight, and just barely spotted a figure through the darkness of the late night, early morning looking down on them from the rooftops. A growl left Ms. Monday's lips and she raised her fists in front of her. How the hell are you awake? You were passed out cold? Zoro laughed lightly before his grin widened and he eyed the large woman predatorily. A true swordsman never drinks more than he can handle. Kitetsu flashed through the air to rest at his side. And I think I've got you guys figured out. He walked to the edge of the rooftop he stood on and looked out to the many forms that surrounded him. You tricked pirates into celebrating their passage on the Grand Line. The Verde let his gaze roam the crowd and got a rough count of the enemy combatants, his grin growing ever larger. Looks to be about 100 of you. He bent his knees and launched himself off the roof, feet slamming into the ground directly in front of the door while the rising dust partially obscured his form. I don't know who the hell you are and I don't really care. He slashed his blade through the floating particles and they scattered, leaving him in plain sight once again. Kitetsu came back up, stilling in the air, and Zoro held it to point in the direction of the two standing in the middle of the crowd. Letting his predatory gaze settle on the man who'd proclaimed himself mayor of Whiskey Peak. If it's a fight you want, I'll take you on, all of you. The tension in the air was palpable as a moment of silence passed. The large group of bounty hunters staring at their soon-to-be adversary and waiting to see who would be the first to make a move. They didn't have to wait long. Kill him! Mr. 8 suddenly shouted, removing something from the inside of his black coat. At his words, a roar left the crowd of bounty hunters and their weapons were in their hands in an instant, all of them rushing toward the swordsman with the intent to kill. Zoro watched the blonde man pull out what looked like an instrument. He couldn't help but scoff even with the many bounty hunters converging on his position. What the hell was a saxophone going to do in this situation? Rapidly approaching footsteps brought his eyes away from the golden saxophone now aimed in his direction and he was met with a wall of bodies, all with weapons pointing in his direction. Gunfire ripped through the area and the soles of the swordsman's boots dug into the soft dirt at his feet, cracks ripping through the ground when he pushed off to the left. The storm of bullets passed through empty space and impacted the building at his back but he paid it no mind, the first of his victims entering his vision. A cutlass burst down toward the Verde's head and it only took the flick of his wrist to push it off course, Kitetsu flashing outward to find the man's throat. Blood flowed down his katana as he held it there and the blade seemed to almost hum in delight. Without a second thought, he ripped his hand outward and a head fell to the ground at his feet, specks of blood splattering across his face. The swordsman didn't even watch the body fall before he was on the move again, blood spurting into the air with every strike of his katana. Bodies fell like dominoes as the wave of carnage that was Roronoa Zoro moved through them like a shadow in the night. Screams of fear and pain consuming the air around him. The large grin never left his face as he barreled through enemy after enemy. The look made even more demonic from the blood now covering the majority of his form. Zoro skid to a stop when he met a wall of barrels aimed in his direction, eyes widening. He dove to the ground just before the shots were fired and could feel the wind of the projectiles pass over his head. However, he was already rising to his feet once more. Before the group could even think to fire again, Kitetsu had sliced through the air. A bright purple arc leaving the edge of the blade and lighting up the surrounding darkness with an ominous glow as it traveled. Screams of fear were suddenly cut off and replaced by short and sharp intakes of breath when the slash met the group of gunners, their bodies falling to the ground in halves. He didn't stay still long enough to watch the copious amounts of blood stain the dirt underneath them as he was already on the move once again, eyes pinging through all the shouting people trying to kill him. There were still a ton of them. The swordsman quickly sheathed his blade before anyone could reach him and hovered his palm over its pommel, feet digging into the dirt below. Itoryu. His legs extended and he seemed to almost disappear from the area, the surrounding bounty hunters looking for him in confusion. Lion song, a clicking sound rang through the air as Zoro finished sheathing his blade and he turned to watch a line of 10 or so people fall to the ground, blood flowing heavily from the singular deep cut consuming all of their chests. He breathed deeply and prepared to unsheath his blade once more but never got the chance, the deep voice of a woman sounding at his back. "All right, I've seen you kill enough of my coworkers, time to die." The Verdade turned on his vision was consumed with a fist covered in brass knuckles. Metal impacted the skin on his forehead and a grunt left his lips when his back smashed into the ground. A cloud of smoke covering his form along with the large dark-skinned woman who'd attacked him. The surrounding combatants slid to a stop while they waited for the dust to clear, most nervously holding their weapons at the ready with a white-knuckled grip. Surely a hit like that from Ms. Monday of all people would have at least knocked him out, right? A groan rose from an orange-haired figure rummaging through what seemed to be yet another empty house. Well, empty of anything she would want to steal. Nami rose from her position next to the large empty chest in front of her and kicked it in frustration, its lid slamming shut from the impact. A yelp left her lips and she tenderly tested her foot on the ground, scowling at the empty container. She sighed and turned away to look over the rest of the sparse house. She'd combed over pretty much all of the one-room building but had found nothing. Just like all the other buildings she'd entered, it had brought her to a conclusion that frustrated her to no end. These people had absolutely nothing. She just knew those two bounty hunters had been lying about the reward. The orangeette shook her frustration away and let her eyes roam over the room one last time, looking for anything she may have missed. As luck would have it, her eyes caught a loose floorboard and she felt a jolt of excitement in her stomach. In an instant, she was lifting the piece of wood from its place on the floor and was met with a simple burlap sack. She glanced at it curiously before shrugging to herself and lifting it from the small space, already opening its flap to get a look inside. What met Nami's vision when she saw its contents had her groaning once again, but she still reached inside and fetched the items. The first was a book, and when she opened it she realized it was some sort of diary, something she had absolutely zero interest in. However, that didn't stop her from opening it and reading a few of the entries. From what she could tell, the writings were a woman's and, apparently, she'd left her island to pursue adventure. She went to read a few more of the entries, but stopped herself, wanting to examine the other two items. The girl set the book on the ground and glanced at what looked like some sort of log pose but different. The glass sphere was encased in wood, and when she flipped it over to look at its front, she realized that something was carved into the wood. It was a single word and it read, "Saloon." What the hell was this thing? It took her a moment of looking between her log pose and the strange one in her hand before she thought she began to understand. If her assumption was correct, she was holding onto a log pose that stayed locked to one particular place. If her assumption was wrong, well, then she had no idea what this thing was. Nami looked away from the strange compass and eyed the last item. It looked to be some sort of priestess garb, and the only thing that kept it from being completely generic was the large, ornate, crescent-shaped moon resting in the center of the breast area. She went to unfold the clothing but stopped herself when she heard footsteps, panic shooting through her body. She quickly pocketed the log pose before shoving the other two items back into the sack and placing it back into the small compartment under the floor. The orangeette slid the floorboard into place as quietly as she could and desperately glanced around the space, looking for anywhere to hide. Her eyes landed on the empty chest she'd looked through only moments ago and she rushed toward it, opening the top just as the rushed footsteps stopped at the door. Without a thought, she jumped inside and shut the top, keeping it open just enough for her to peer out. The lock to the front door clicked and the wood swung outward, a panicked woman going directly for the floorboard that had only just been replaced. "Oh God," she said to herself, lifting her bag and throwing it over her shoulder. "I should have listened to Priestess Luna." She left the secret compartment open without care and rushed back to the door, a shiver of fear running down her spine as she rushed through and left it wide open. "I don't belong anywhere where demons like that can exist." Nami watched the woman exit as quickly as she could and could only think one thing as she slowly pushed the top of the chest back open. Just what the hell was Zoro doing out there? Chapter 49. Demons and Angels. "Alright, I've seen you kill enough of my coworkers, time to die," Ms. Monday growled, wrenching one of her brass-knuckled fists back as far as she could. Zoro spun, panicked, while his hand grasped at Kitetsu's handle. Before he could grab it and pull the blade free, an extremely hard fist collided with his forehead, the skin underneath it immediately rupturing while blood splattered across the offending appendage. His back crashed straight into the ground, cracks ripping through the earth underneath him, and his eyes widened when he saw the now red-colored fist enter his vision once again. A roar of exertion left Ms. Monday's mouth as she drove her knuckles into the swordsman's head for the second time. another loud crack piercing through the air. She held her fist in place, vision obscured by the swirling brown clouds surrounding them, and continued to grind downward to ensure her opponent wouldn't be getting up again. The woman huffed when she felt she'd done enough damage, staring down at the figure below her, and slowly stood, waiting with bated breath to see if the pirate would retaliate. Surely that had knocked him out at least, right? Not bad. The Verde mused, licking up some of the blood dripping from his forehead. You're pretty strong. He wrenched himself from the ground, shifting to the side on instinct, and grabbed the arm careening past his face by the wrist, pulling his attacker in close so she could see him clearly, but not strong enough. His other palm flashed out as he stood to his feet and wrapped around the woman's head, grip strengthening while he lifted her into the air. He felt her struggle against him, but he wouldn't soon be losing this battle, not with all the work he'd put in to make himself stronger. With a growl, Zoro squeezed his digits as tightly as he could, and the woman's voice seemed to rise a few pitches before it was cut off completely with one last piercing scream, her consciousness vanishing from the waking world. As the dust cleared and the two forms became visible once again, the surrounding bounty hunters gawked at the image of one of their strongest being held in the air by her head, unmoving. Holy shit, he did that to Ms. Monday? Are we gonna be okay? I think we're all gonna die. Many more shocked whispers rolled through the surrounding bounty hunters, but Zoro blocked them out, taking in a deep breath and letting Ms. Monday's unconscious body drop to the ground without a care. In the blink of an eye, Kitetsu was drawn, and the sound that accompanied the action shocked his enemies back into reality, weapons being readied for a fight more bloody than anyone present thought possible. Mr. 8 watched the swordsman jump into the fray once again and almost couldn't find it in himself to shoot his unconventional weapon. He'd never seen such a display of martial prowess, and the sight had left him incapable of movement. It felt like if he moved he would die. Ms. Wednesday was more right than she knew. It brought him to the conclusion that some sort of mistake must have been made. There was no way this man wasn't the one the bounty was supposed to belong to. More red coated Zoro's face as the body in front of him fell in half vertically, and he ducked under a massive stone hammer while watching his victim splat against the ground in two. He rotated on his heel, Kitetsu coming up to meet the weapon when its owner attempted to bring it down on his head, and steel met stone in a battle of strength. The falling heavy halves created two small craters at his feet as his katana sliced through like butter, and with a single step and another slash of his blade and arm fell to the dirt, still gripping the handle of the hammer. The Verde left the man screaming and pushed off the balls of his feet into the next group of incoming adversaries, katana flashing out low to the left, then up and directly right. Its razor-sharp edge drew blood from three of the bounty hunters in front of him, and his eyes followed a man now missing one of his legs, severed at the knee, as he dodged a wild swipe from one of the two he'd blinded with slashes across the eyes. His form lowered before launching upward and over the rest of those who were still standing, grip on Kitetsu tightening while his muscles bulged underneath his blood-soaked shirt. Itoryu. Zoro's eyes caught the many forms of those below and grit his teeth, gripping his right wrist with his free hand. He breathed in deeply, and an ominous presence seemed to fill the surrounding air as he looked down on his soon-to-be victims, form already beginning to descend back to the ground. As an attack designed for use against a single opponent, he'd have to adjust, but he had a feeling he'd manage. A bloody grin rose to the swordsman's lips, and an ominous purple glow appeared in his eye as his sword screamed through the air. A purple afterimage of Kitetsu following the blade itself, Blood Dragon's Lust. The bounty hunters looking up at Zoro's descending form were mesmerized by the intangible image of a roaring purple dragon appearing behind him, and it seemed like their surroundings suddenly went dark for a moment. A long purple slash with flickering edges of violet fire appeared in the black depths, and none found themselves able to move in the face of what most knew would be their death. The attack moved with so much speed that no one could even blink before it sliced through the entirety of the group, and the screams of those who passed from the slash itself were followed by those who'd managed to somehow survive, their bleeding bodies alight with searing purple flames. The Verde's feet slammed back into the ground, and he was immediately on the move again, Kitetsu snaking out to end those still suffering from his strike. While flaming bodies fell to the ground at his rushing feet, his eyes darted through the still incoming combatants, grin widening. He hadn't felt a rush like this in quite a while. He shook the thought away and slid under a wild sword swipe directed at his middle, spinning to slash behind the man's knees. He finished his cut and pulled the falling form in front of him to absorb several bullets shot in his direction, a choked gurgle coming from his makeshift shield. Zoro tossed the now dead man to the side and ripped Kitetsu across his body. Another flying slash leaving the edge of the blade. He followed in behind it as closely as he could and leapt over the forms it met, cries of agony sounding at his back as he pushed onward, grin ever present on his blood-spattered face. There was still much more fun to be had. Stop right there. A woman in nun's garb stuttered while she hugged what looked to be a small child to her chest. Please don't hurt us. The Verde slid to slow himself down at the words, the pounding of footsteps sounding at his back, and he eyed the two skeptically. As soon as he came to a halt, they each drew a weapon, the woman stepping in his direction and pulling back her large mace while the seemingly young boy drew a flintlock from the back of his pants. A sigh left Zoro's mouth and he easily parried the weak attack, flipping his grip on Kitetsu to hold it like an ice pick. Deception has no place on my battlefield. He spun around her so they were back to back and his katana sunk into the woman's spine, ripping it upward so it came out of the top of her head, and neither do you. Blood showered the swordsman, covering his already soaked form in even more crimson as he flipped his katana and swiped it to the side to remove the dark liquid covering its surface. His eyes found the child holding the flintlock in his direction and, before it could be fired, he slashed downward to split the weapon's barrel down the middle. The action caused the figure to instinctually pull the trigger and a small explosion sent his fingers flying in every direction, a deep, masculine scream leaving the child, now grasping his destroyed hand in agony. Without any remorse, Zoro let his blade bite into the man's temple. Skull was lopped off in the blink of an eye, screams instantly ceasing as his body fell to the ground with blood gushing from the open wound that was his head. He ruffled his nose at the sight of bleeding brain matter before the steps at his back grabbed his attention once again. A golden glint somewhere in the crowd caught his eye and he wasted no time in diving into the numerous oncoming attackers, Kitetsu drinking deeply from those he passed. Blood ran like a river at the Verde's feet as he moved toward the center of the 20 or so bounty hunters in front of him. The sound of a saxophone being played, terribly he might add, sounded above the cries of the dying men and women he'd left behind, and he dove forward, uncertain of what the person holding it was attempting to do. A whizzing sound whipped by his head and he resisted the urge to pat himself on the back as he rolled up to his feet, eyes once again locking onto the man who'd fired the instrument. What the hell kind of saxophone was that? While the first mate of the Straw Hat Pirates battled against the wave of bounty hunters outside, the rest of the crew remaining in the building, the party was held and slept soundly without an inkling as to what was happening. The only things on their minds were the blissful dreams they were wrapped up in. Well, blissful for some, strange for others. "Hello?" Luffy questioned into the vast expanse of darkness in front of him. He continued to look out into the void and waited for an answer, but it never came. The boy squinted his eyes to try finding something besides the black expanse consuming his vision, but could see nothing and couldn't help but find that weird. Where the hell was he? He lightly shook his head and repeated his earlier words, "Healu?" Nothing. With a sigh of defeat, Luffy once again began to look for something besides darkness and, in doing so, turned to see what was behind him. There was no flash or any sign to denote a change in the strange space. However, suddenly, where there was once an endless expanse of black, there was now white, and he was pretty sure that it wasn't light that met his vision but literally the color white, as far as the eye could see. "What the hell?" the pirate captain whispered to himself, eyes glancing around the strange space curiously. He turned back around and, once again, his vision was consumed by darkness. What was this place? "You surprise me, my friend." Luffy jumped at the voice reverberating from the inside of his skull, head whipping around as he searched for its source. It sounded like a woman. "Hello?" he shouted into the dark emptiness. "There is no need to fear. You're safe here." It was strange, but the words set the teen at ease even though he had no clue who or where they were coming from. And, the more he thought about it, the more he came to realize that the voice almost seemed familiar. However, as curious as he was about who was speaking to him, he was more curious about where he was. "Where are we?" he asked the voice, once again glancing through the darkness. A question with a far deeper answer than you realize, one I don't believe you are quite ready for. Luffy stared blankly into the darkness. What the hell's that supposed to mean? An angelic laugh echoed through the space at his words and his head whipped around wildly as he searched for it. Like I said, I'm afraid the answers to your questions must wait. For some reason, even though the voice sounded in his head, he also heard it out in the open as well and turned toward where he thought it came from. To add to the strangeness he'd already been met with, when he'd rotated about 90 degrees, the opaque darkness consuming his vision was suddenly split down the middle. Now, half the space was dark black and the other half was a stark white. He stopped in place and eyed the hard line separating the colors before getting a little curious and turning all the way around. White was suddenly all Luffy could see, even when he looked back over his shoulder to see if the black half was still there. He quickly turned the other way and the darkness consumed him once again, wherever he was. It was a weird place. He slowly continued to rotate until he found the spot where black and white stood together once more and glanced in between them curiously for a moment before the voice chimed in. Your spirit isn't strong enough yet. So, continue to grow, and when next we meet, hopefully, you will be ready for the answers you seek. The words confused the teen and he lifted his head to what should have been the sky as a strange ringing sound began to fill the space. His eyes widened and he desperately shifted his gaze across the black-white expanse when he felt something begin to pull him upward. Wait, who are you? The angelic laugh sounded for a second time, and even though there was no visual change in perspective, he could tell his form was beginning to rise, the strange space around him starting to dissipate into non-existence. The last thing Luffy saw before the black-white world around him disappeared completely was a pair of pure black eyes looking at him with nothing but kindness and kinship. A friend. White? Luffy whispered to himself as his eyes slowly opened. He rubbed the sleep out of them and slowly sat up. What the hell was that dream? Was that White he was talking to? He could have sworn those were her eyes. It had been a while, so he wasn't completely sure, but still. He shook his head and couldn't help the small smile that played on his lips as he made to stand to his feet, the charms on his necklace clinking together softly as he rose. Whatever that dream had been, he considered it a good one, even with it being as strange as it was. The pirate captain sighed and looked around the room for his friends, only to find two of them missing from the space. Where the heck were Zoro and Nami? He stood to his feet while simultaneously stretching his muscles, and a large yawn left his mouth when he placed his hat back on his head. That had been a really nice sleep. He glanced over at Sanji and Usopp still snoring on the floor and debated whether to wake them or not, staring for a moment before eventually deciding to do so. If he was up, they might as well be too. Sanji, Usopp, he said, walking over to nudge the two. Luffy, Sanji replied, rubbing his face groggily. What time is it? He slowly sat up and looked around the empty room, searching for the others, only to find the main target of his search missing. And where's Nami? He asked, watching Usopp groggily sit up across from him. Is Zoro missing, too? The long-nosed teen questioned tiredly, noticing the swordsman's form gone along with their navigators, not to mention everyone else that was here when I fell asleep. Luffy turned away from the two as they stood to their feet, shrugging. Everyone else was gone when I woke up. He looked over his shoulder and waved at them to follow when he stepped toward the door. Come on, let's go find him. The two nodded with a pair of yawns, stretching the stiffness from their muscles while they followed behind their captain and prepared to exit the building. Luffy wasted no time in pulling the door open, and the sight that met the group's vision had them halting in place before any more steps could be taken, similar thoughts rolling through each of their heads. What the hell had happened while they were asleep? Dead and bleeding bodies filled the street in front of them, along with all sorts of severed body parts and fallen weapons, and they couldn't help but stare in shock, Usopp turning away to dry heave into the crook of his elbow. The pirate captain incredulously scanned the immediate area for a moment before turning to look at Sanji from over his shoulder, sending him a knowing look. Zoro. Mosshead. Agree. Usopp stopped in the middle of his reply and dry heaved once again, taking a moment before attempting to look out the opening for the third time. Agreed. It had been in something even close to the veritable sea of blood running through the street in front of them, the last time being during one of their bounty hunting adventures. And, even then, it wasn't quite to this extent. I'm gonna look for Nami, Sanji said, stepping past Luffy and out into the red-colored street. I'd imagine we'll probably be leaving soon. He ruffled his nose when he realized he'd have to step through various puddles of blood, but continued nonetheless, eyes scanning the area for any signs of their orange-haired navigator. Damn, Mosshead was ruthless. He found just as many women as he did men amongst the dead, his mouth curling downward in a frown, but shook his head and looked over his shoulder, shouting to the other two before taking off to the left, down a dark alley. "We'll come to you guys when I find her." The words went unanswered as the two remaining members of the Straw Hat Pirates continued to stare out at the bloodied street, the sight not quite sitting right with the captain of the crew. But they were so nice, Luffy pouted, wondering what could have happened to make his first mate go on this massacre, for lack of a better word. The food was so good. Zoro wasn't usually one to kill without reason, so he figured they had to have done something. Still though, he was kinda bummed. The party had been really fun. "Alright, Usopp, let's go find Zoro," he said without turning, taking his first steps out into the street. "I don't think it should be too hard." The sniper couldn't help but agree with the sentiment and made to follow his captain. He imagined all they'd have to do was follow the trail of bodies. Were any of the townspeople even still alive? "Running'll do you no good," Zoro stated, slashing Kitetsu through the air while he stalked in Mr. 8's direction. The purple flying slash released from his blade cleaved through several of the bounty hunters sprinting into attack, and his steps continued uninterrupted, their bodies crashing into the dirt. The blond man's breaths came out short and erratic, the same as his retreating footsteps. He couldn't even find words as he looked over his shoulders and saw more of his compatriots fall at the feet of what he now knew was a demon disguising himself in human skin. His eyes shot back forward and his speed increased, panic racking his body to the extent that he could barely keep a firm grasp on his saxophone. Of the close to 100 people stationed at Whiskey Peak, he was one of the few still left standing, and their numbers were only dropping further. He needed to find Ms. Wednesday, and quickly. Screams and choked breaths continued to fill the air at Mr. 8's back as he rushed through the streets as quickly as he could, eyes searching through the many small buildings for any signs of the woman's blue hair. His eyes widened when he caught two figures walking toward him from the opposite side of the street, and he waved his hands to try flagging them down, casting another desperate glance over his shoulder. He gulped at the blood-covered figure still stalking in his direction, while the few remaining bounty hunters who hadn't run or died attempted to take the swordsman's head. The man squeezed his eyes shut and turned away when he saw another group of no less than 5 all lose their lives at the same time, and his waving became even more desperate. Just when he was close enough to finally make out the figures, his gaze was caught by something small flying through the air, directly toward his chest, and he ignored it, thinking it was a small piece of dirt or something of the like. It was a mistake. Light consumed Mr. 8's eyes and his body rippled upon the speck's impact, a fiery explosion consuming his form. The clothing covering his chest shredded underneath the blast, and he shot back in the direction he'd come from with a scream of pain, body roughly crashing into the earth and rolling a good distance before stopping. He groaned and made to stand up, but stopped when a sword planted itself into the ground next to his head. "Who's that?" Zoro questioned, rolling the injured man over with his foot. "Seems like they don't like you too much." He shook his head when the only answer he got was groaning, and pulled Kitetsu free from the dirt, raising it over his head. "Doesn't really matter, I guess. I'll just ask M myself." Wait, the blond man managed to get out just before he would have been relieved of his head. "Please." He looked up into the predatory black orbs staring down at him and had to resist the urge to look away in fear. I can't die, not yet. Not until I know she's safe." He knew his words would likely fall on deaf ears, but he had to try, for Alabasta, for Vivi herself. The Verdes stared down at the figure for a moment before scoffing. "Yeah, I don't really do the whole mercy thing." The words made the man sigh, and he closed his eyes remorsefully. Hopefully, Vivi was safe and somewhere far, far away from this man. Upon the closing of Mr. 8's eyes, Zoro's grip on Kitetsu tightened as he prepared to snuff the life from the man at his feet. However, just when he went to bring his katana downward, a loud voice stopped him in place. "Zoro?" The swordsman lowered his blade with a small groan and turned toward the voice he recognized as his captain's. "Over here, Luffy." He was hoping to have things finished before everyone woke up. The straw-hatted teen exited the blood-stained alleyway with Usopp on his tail and was met with another open street. Well, besides the dead people everywhere. Open of anything living, he should probably say. He turned his head toward where his first mate's voice had come from and found the swordsman standing there with one of his blades at his side, covered head to toe in blood. He also seemed to be standing over someone and, if he remembered correctly, It was the man who'd introduced himself as mayor of the town. "I think he's gonna need some new clothes." Usopp mused morbidly, eyes shifting to the various bodies littering the street. He saw none currently living on their way here, so he assumed that everyone who'd greeted them upon their arrival was either dead or had run for their lives. "If you would be so kind, that man's life is ours to take." Zoro turned away from his two approaching crewmates and toward where the high-pitched voice had come from, gaze landing on two more figures approaching from the opposite end of the street. He stepped over the wheezing man on the ground and held up Kitetsu defensively. The figure on the right seemed to be a man and, from what the Verde could see in the moonlight, he wore a long red coat that covered the entirety of his dark skin. A pair of dark red sunglasses rested on the bridge of his nose to match the lighter red-colored scarf he wore under his jacket. He stared for a moment, assessing the figure before his gaze shifted to the one who spoke. The woman next to him was dressed in a long yellow dress that only left her feet showing, and it was covered in lemons. Zoro shook his head at the strange design choice and his eyes rose to find the matching beanie that rested atop her head. All in all, the two were a strange pair. Similar to the two bounty hunters they'd met earlier in their journey. "I'm more of a first-come first-served kinda guy," he said, staring the woman down as they continued to approach, "so, you're gonna have to go through me if you want to get to him." Mr. 8's eyes widened from his place on the ground. Thank you." "Shut it, old man," Zoro interrupted, readying himself for another fight. "It's your turn after them." "Who the heck are these guys?" Luffy asked, stopping next to his green-haired friend with Usopp only a few steps behind. Zoro watched the pair halt in place a ways away from them, Kitetsu still tightly grasped in his hand. "Dunno. Think I was just about to find out," he answered without taking his eyes off the two who he assumed to be enemies. He went to say more but stopped himself when a voice rang the alleyways. "Igaram!" Ms. Wednesday shouted, slapping a hand over her mouth. "I mean, Mr. 8. Mr. 9 went to stop his partner but almost immediately sunk back into the darkness of the alleyway when he saw the many bloody bodies littering the street, his form shaking violently as he stepped backward. With one last glance at the woman's sprinting figure, he turned and ran as fast as he could. No way was he going out there. He'd heard enough screaming on their way there to know this was no time to try and be a hero. And, now that he was seeing the remains of those the screams had likely been coming from. Nope. He was getting the hell out of there and praying to whoever was looking down on him from above that he wasn't found. The blue-haired woman wasted no time in rushing out into the open, and, apparently, it was the wrong decision because, as soon as she did, the voice of one of the figures standing across from where her companion lay rang out to address her. However, she didn't stop until she was on the ground next to the man. "Ms. Wednesday. How nice of you to join us," Mr. 5 exclaimed, turning to his partner. "Would y'all look at that, Ms. Valentine? Just the two people we were looking for." He turned back to the now foursome, his partner giggling at his words, and went to address the swordsman again. However, he was beaten to the punch. "Can someone tell me what the hell's going on?" Luffy shouted, throwing his hands up in exasperation while Usopp nodded his agreement at the line of questioning. "I come outside after these people threw us a great party and everything's all bloody. There's body parts everywhere, dead people." He groaned and looked over to his first mate. "I guess what I'm asking is if I need to punch you for killing everyone that was nice to us." Zoro peeled his eyes away from the two standing in the street and sent his captain a look that said, "Really? You really think I would do all this without a reason?" Luffy only stared at the other boy, the action being parroted by the long-nosed teen behind him. A moment of silence consumed the air as they all stared at each other before it was broken by Zoro, a sigh of defeat leaving his mouth. Things had gotten out of hand one time. One time. And he was never gonna hear the end of it. "They were planning on cashing in your bounty from what I heard," he finally answered, turning back to the two still standing at the opposite end of the street. The words made Luffy look down to find Blue Girl trying her best to help Mayor Guy back to his feet. He really needed to get better at remembering names. "So, you guys are bounty hunters or something?" he asked curiously. He felt like he remembered someone saying something along those lines some time ago, but with the excitement of the party overshadowing everything he couldn't really remember. "Funny you should ask that." Mr. 5 chimed in, because, until we got here, her answer would have been yes. "Ain't that right, Ms. Wednesday?" He caught the blue-haired girl's eyes and grinned in her direction, or should I say, Princess Vivi. A gasp left the two forms at Luffy's back and he couldn't help but look at them curiously. Princess? He peeled his eyes away and let his gaze settle on the dark sky, groaning in irritation. I still have no idea what's happening right now. Were they fighting? Were they talking? Zoro had obviously been fighting someone, but he didn't know if that was over or not. The two at the end of the street just kept standing there and it was only making him more confused. I think we should probably take care of these two first. Zoro started, his legs tensing in preparation for the coming fight. His bloody grin returned at the prospect of going up against someone stronger than the rabble he'd already taken care of. We can get some answers from them after, he said, nodding over his shoulder. Sound good? Luffy smiled at the words. Finally, something he could understand. I think I can get behind that, he replied, his muscles tensing similarly to the boy next to him. He glanced over at his green-haired friend and went to say something more but stopped when ice shot down his spine. He turned just in time to see something small arcing through the air on a direct course for their group. Was that a booger? He wasted no time in smacking the makeshift projectile to the side in disgust, completely unsuspecting of the explosion that sent him flying in the opposite direction. Luffy, Usopp and Zoro shouted at the same time as they watched the boy's form sail through the air before crashing and rolling roughly through the blood-soaked dirt. Zoro wrenched his eyes away, knowing it would take a lot more than that to seriously damage his captain, and glared at his offender, the soles of his boots cracking into the ground underneath. That was a bad idea. A small boom ripped through the air and Usopp watched as the swordsman practically disappeared from sight, his eyes just barely able to keep track of the sprinting form. Before he could see the oncoming clash, however, a second boom consumed the night and he was almost blown off his feet as Luffy bounded past him. Zoro's rapid steps carried him inside Mr. Five's guard, and before he could even react, Kitetsu was already coming down to maim the man irreparably. Just when the glinting silver edge of the blade would have met the dark skin between his wide eyes, something else took residence there and he immediately halted in place. The cracking of bone and glass sounded from underneath Luffy's black knuckles and he growled as he extended his arm the rest of the way, a shockwave erupting from the point of impact. Keep your boogers to yourself. He angrily yelled at the figure now flying through the air on a direct course for one of the many buildings lining the street. The shattering of wood met the straw-hatted teen's ears and it only took a moment for it to come again, the sound getting slightly quieter with each subsequent crack. Damn. That had really pissed him off. Who the hell went around flicking boogers at people? Explosive or not? He shook his head and pulled his eyes away from the line of holes stretching through several different buildings with a grunt, turning to face the woman staring at him and his first mate with a pair of wide eyes. As soon as function came back to her body, Ms. Valentine pushed on the non-existent muscles that controlled her devil fruit and her body lightened dramatically. With her umbrella already unfolded, the wind quickly blew her figure into the air. But, even with her reaction coming quickly, she still wasn't able to escape the reach of the swordsman below and felt something wrap around her ankle. Zoro grunted when the foot caught in his grasp suddenly felt like it weighed 10 tons, his grip loosening as the woman cratered back into the ground. His katana flashed downward into the space she now occupied, but once again, he had to stop himself. Tell your partner to stop flicking boogers at people. It's gross, Luffy yelled, his anger practically palpable in the air. His foot slammed into the ground and he wrenched his already cocked black fist forward, air screaming past the blurring appendage. His darkened knuckles met the woman's stomach and he felt almost no resistance as he sent her body flashing down the street, her screaming form flying much further than originally intended. He watched the woman travel backward in an almost straight line before she eventually disappeared from his sight, something catching his eye from the left. Another tingle flitted across the back of the pirate captain's neck and he dropped to the ground, another bit of hardened snot flying over the top of his head. He ignored the sound of an explosion that was accompanied by the tearing of wood and immediately rose, quickly turning back to the place the shot had come from. Mr. Five went to step out of the building but never got the chance, a straw-hatted form sliding into place and stopping his exit from the hole his body had created when he crashed THNT to say something cheeky but couldn't seem to form the words through his brutalized face. What was even happening right now? He and Miss Valentine hadn't heard anything about these two. They'd only come for the princess and her bodyguard. He shook his head and a few garbled groans left his mouth at the action. One thing was for sure. Whoever this kid was, he could throw a fucking punch. Luffy watched with a narrowed gaze as the man's eyes widened out, stepping to the side when he fell forward and crashed face first into the dirt. He waited for a moment to see if there would be any more movement coming from him but eventually turned away with a sigh. Hopefully, he'd taught the bastard a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. His gaze landed on Usopp and the two he stood over as they stared at him in bewilderment, and he couldn't help the laughter that rose from his throat. Why were people always looking at him like that? The straw-hatted teen rode his giggles out and approached the group, making to address them before he stopped himself, a familiar voice ringing out from one of many other alleyways leading into the street. I mean, Zoro. Nami's sweat dropped as she peeled her eyes away from the part of the street that was filled with blood and bodies. She watched the swordsman turn in her and Sanji's direction and met his gaze with an exasperated look. Did you really have to kill everyone? Chapter 50? Sunday Special. Ms. Wednesday watched the surrounding pirate crew closely as they stared at her and Mr. 8, taking a deep breath and hoping with everything she had that they'd believe her story. Her real story. It was probably one of the riskier things she'd done in her life. But what choice did she have? Mr. Zero obviously knew of their identities, which meant she and Igaram needed to get back home as quickly as they could. Before any of the other Straw Hats could answer, a scoff left Nami's mouth. So, let me get this straight. The navigator said skeptically, you're trying to tell us that you're actually the princess of some country none of us have ever heard of, and, on top of that, you want us to take you back there out of the goodness of our hearts. Another scoff left her mouth at the tentative nod of the blue-haired girl's head, and she turned to the rest of the crew. We're not buying this, right? Please. Igaram interjected, bowing in the direction of who he still assumed to be the captain of the crew. We wouldn't ask this of you if there were any other options. And it was the truth. He was extremely reluctant to let Vivi even stand near the swordsman who decimated the ranks of Baroque works, let alone travel with him. However, with the way things had panned out, there was no other choice. Mr. Zero knows of our identities and will have us eliminated at any cost. He added with his head still bowed. Zoro eyed the man curiously. Why though? If they were telling the truth, then the boss of their organization was trying to kill them. For what reason exactly? The blonde-haired man took a deep breath and stood from his prostrated position, once again addressing the group that had them surrounded. If you knew the inner workings of Baroque works like we do, he said, pointing between himself and Vivi, then you'd know that it's based around complete anonymity. No one knows who anyone else really is. He took a shaky breath and continued. Our mission was to discover Mr. Zero's identity and get close so as to have a chance to remove him from the equation. Always aim for the head, as they say. Luffy lifted his head up from his place lying on the ground and looked at the two with a bored expression. I'm gonna be honest, I don't really care about any of this. At the moment he was antsy and all the talk of bounty hunters and kingdoms was kind of a drag. Plus, after throwing those couple of punches, a part of him was itching for a fight. He looked over to his first mate and an irritated huff left his lips as he lay back to look up at the night sky. Stupid Zoro just had to kill everyone before he got the chance to join in. Did you guys complete this mission of yours? Usopp asked curiously. Obviously, he didn't want to know their boss's name if they were being truthful about the danger such knowledge came with, but he couldn't help but be a little curious. Vivi and Igaram glanced at each other nervously before the blue-haired girl turned back. Yes, she tentatively replied, however, I can't tell you his name as that would put you in his sights the same as us. They may be pirates, but she wasn't keen on putting anyone else in the kind of danger she and Igaram were in. She looked back at the carnage left in the wake of the green-haired swordsman standing across from her. And as strong as you and your crew may be, you're no match for Sir Crocodile. Her hand slapped over her mouth directly after the name left her lips and she turned back with a pair of wide eyes. Silence consumed the air as the Straw Hat Pirates stared blankly at the girl, and it lasted a good long moment before it was broken by Luffy. You're really stupid. The pirate captain sighed, eyes never leaving the dark sky above. It kind of reminded him of the dream he'd had earlier in the night. Minus the stars. He shook his head and sat up. So, what makes this crocodile guy so scary? Don't say his name, Vivi hissed as quietly as she could. A blush rising to her cheeks while her eyes shifted through the area to search for any who may be listening. Sanji's sweat dropped at the words. Hadn't she said it not 5 seconds ago? He went to comment but stopped himself when the flapping of wings began to sound from somewhere over their heads. He glanced upward and saw the silhouettes of what seemed to be two birds flying off toward the docks. A frown finding its way onto his face when he looked closer. Was something riding one of them? The rest of the group looked up and Vivi almost immediately paled. "Oh no," she whispered, eyes locked to the two forms beginning to grow smaller the higher they got. "That's not good." Nami saw the way the supposed princess was looking at the retreating avians and frowned similarly to the boy on her left, looking over to Usopp to give him a nudge. "Hey," she whispered when he turned toward her. She pointed up at the birds now far enough away that she almost couldn't see them. "Can you shoot them down?" She didn't really know why she was asking in all honesty. The only thing she could say was she just had a feeling and she'd learned to trust her instincts after being around her friends for so long. Before the long-nosed teen could respond, Luffy shot up from his place on the ground, having listened in on the short conversation. "I got it," he exclaimed happily. Finally, something to do besides talking. Without another thought, his legs bent, muscles tensing, before he extended them sharply and rocketed himself into the sky. A crater blasted into existence underneath his feet and those around him had to hold their ears from the loud crack that accompanied the action, each of them watching his form practically vanish from their sight. Vivi winced when a second boom ripped through the air and, thankfully, it sent him far enough away to make the subsequent cracks quiet enough that she no longer had to hold her ears. She'd honestly forgotten he could do that, surprising considering the amount of time she spent watching him during their travels. She looked over to Igaram when the pirate's ascending figure disappeared from her vision, muffled booms still sounding from somewhere in the distance, and found him staring at the crater that had been left behind. Oh yeah, she'd forgotten to tell him that he could fly, well, kind of. The soles of Luffy's sandals mashed into the air over and over until the animals came into his sight once again, smiling wide at the realization that he hadn't misfired yet. He'd gotten so much better since he'd learned how to do this. With one more extension of his legs, followed by another loud boom, his body collided with one of the birds desperately trying to escape from him once they'd realized he was in pursuit. As soon as his arms wrapped around what he now knew was a buzzard, he suddenly realized that he'd caught something else in his grasp as well. The teen stared into the dark glasses of an otter as it looked back with an expression of bewilderment and smiled, arms tightening so he wouldn't lose either of them to the winds whipping by his face. He ignored their futile struggles and looked up to find the other bird flapping its wings as hard as it could, grin widening. His leg shot out again and Luffy expected to catch up to his target in an instant. However, when the appendage fully straightened, the only thing he felt was the rattling of his bones. His eyes widened and he tried again with the same result. With his trajectory beginning to change from a rise to a fall, he took one last look at his escaping prey and groaned loudly, arms tightening around the two smaller forms in his arms. "This is probably gonna hurt, guys." Loud squawks and the screams of the otter in one of his arms burst into the air as the trio began to rapidly fall, the boy quickly enhancing the entirety of his body. If he was better at hardening, he'd have done that instead, but the small amount he could cover himself in wouldn't be enough to really help that much. Plus, it would diminish the strength of the invisible armor that Ao. So, with his eyes finding the quickly approaching ground, Luffy braced himself, legs shooting out rapidly one after the other to try and find purchase on something. After one last failed attempt, he grit his teeth and hugged the animals he'd caught even closer before bracing himself for their impending impact. A thundering crash lit the silence of the night as the three connected with the earth, the dirt street shattering around the teen's body when it imprinted itself into the large crater that formed around him. A loud groan left his lips as loose rubble crumbled around his shifting figure and he slowly sat up. Even with his enhancement keeping him from breaking anything, that hadn't felt good. The cloud of dust partially obscuring his vision began to settle and Luffy looked down to see if the animals he'd captured had made it through their landing. They hadn't. Blood, bone, feathers, and fur covered the front of his chest, along with broken shards of dark glass, and he frowned for a moment while he looked at himself. Well, Nami hadn't said they needed to be alive. He looked back up to search for the one that had gotten away but was met with nothing other than the starry skies. "You look quite disgusting if I do say so myself." The pirate captain's head shot back down at the sound of the voice and he almost immediately recognized the figure standing on the docks, as she'd appeared in his dreams on more than one occasion. "Pretty lady," he exclaimed with a big smile. Ms. All-Sunday laughed brightly at his way of addressing her. She was honestly surprised he remembered their meeting. She shook the thought away and lightly bowed in his direction, the one and only. Luffy quickly brushed off the remains of the two animals he'd inadvertently snuffed the life out of and stood to his feet, shaking the soreness from himself. That really hadn't felt good. He shook his head and made to approach but stopped almost immediately, a stray thought crossing his mind. What the heck was she doing there? The woman tilted her head at him curiously, arms crossing at her front. "What is it, Mr. Black Fist?" she asked with a small smile, eyes glinting mischievously. "Do I scare you?" Luffy watched the lady closely. No, well, not really. After having traveled with Nami for so long, he gained a healthy fear of all women. They could be really scary. He let his arms drop down to his side but moved no closer, an awkward silence settling between the two. "Sue, any reason why you're here?" he asked, curiosity eventually getting the better of him. Another silence followed the question before Ms. All-Sunday turned away and gazed back at the quaint little ship she assumed the boy and his crew traveled on. That's a question with a complicated answer. It could take a while to explain," she replied, turning back to the person whose bounty poster she'd been looking at only moments before he'd crashed into the area. "Are you sure you want to spend our short time alone talking about that?" The boy looked at her strangely. "What do you mean, short time?" As far as he was aware, he didn't have anywhere to be. Well, now that he thought about it, that girl needed to get back to her home to stop a war or something, but that didn't really concern him. He hadn't agreed to take her anyway. He looked over his shoulder when she nodded to the area behind him and turned to find his crew, followed by the two they'd been chatting with, walking in their direction. He looked closer when he saw a seventh figure that hadn't been there before and had to rub his eyes to make sure he wasn't seeing things. Was that a duck? And was blue hair girl riding it? What was her name again? "As you can see, we have guests," Ms. All-Sunday said, meeting the teen's eyes as he turned back toward her. She couldn't help but smile at her luck. Plus, she certainly didn't mind getting the chance to chat with Straw Hat Luffy again. She'd very much enjoyed their last conversation. She turned toward the docks once again and pointed to the water. "I see your friend Levi managed to make it into the Grand Line," she commented, watching Nala and the large beast swim circles around each other. "And it seems Nala has taken quite a liking to him." "Nala?" Luffy questioned curiously, peering over the woman's shoulder. His eyes met the water and they immediately widened, an excited smile rising to his lips. "You have a giant turtle?" He looked back at the woman for a moment only to rush straight past her, his next words hitting her back before she could even turn. "That's so cool." The splashing of water and Luffy's words of introduction were all the woman got to hear before her attention was grabbed by the group that had stopped a short way away from her, a small smile rising back to her lips at the sight of the two she'd been searching for. Ms. Wednesday and Mr. 8, as well as the rest of Mr. Black Fist's crew. "It's so kind of you to join us," she mused. "It seems as if you've all had the chance to meet." She met Ms. Wednesday's narrowed gaze and her smile widened. "I'm a bit miffed, Ms. Wednesday. I hope you at least mentioned me." Igaram protectively stepped in front of the princess and pulled his saxophone back out of his coat, gripping it tightly. "Karoo," he whispered over his shoulder, "when I attack, turn around and get Vivi as far away from here as pos." His words were interrupted by a pair of hands covering his mouth, another grabbing his arms and pulling them apart to make him drop his weapon. Now, Mr. 8. Ms. All-Sunday chastised, her folded arms now crossed in front of her in an X. "I like secrets just as much as the next gal, but I really can't stand being left out." She watched as the group prepared for a fight, shaking her head scoldingly. "And I'd appreciate it if you all stayed still. I think you can already imagine what happens if you don't, but, just to make sure, Fleur." Zoro's eyes widened when his arms were pulled behind his back, another pair gripping the top and bottom of his head. His eyes shot around to the others and he came to the realization that all of them were being held captive similarly. Usopp seemed to be freaking out a good bit, kind of like he was reliving a nightmare. Nami seemed mostly bewildered but otherwise relatively normal. The cook was pretty subdued considering he was essentially being held by a woman. And the other two looked to be frightened to their very cores. He looked back to the woman at their front and his vision narrowed as he tested the strength of her grip from behind his back. A TS King sound almost immediately following the action. Could she feel all these things? "I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Mr. Swordsman." the black-haired woman said, her grip on his wrists and head tightening even further. She went to say more but her breath caught in her throat instead, eyes widening at the words suddenly being whispered into her ear. "Hey!" Luffy greeted quietly from over her shoulder, eyes locked to his friend's still forms. "I like your power a lot and you've got a really nice turtle. But, those are my friends. Well, most of them are," in what seemed like the blink of an eye. His hands were resting on her chin and the top of her head, mirroring those across from them. "Anyway," he whispered seriously, "you wanna die or let them go?" For the first time in a long time, Ms. All Sunday was consumed with fear, large blue orbs growing to the size of saucers. Her hands started to shake and she could feel sweat beginning to gather on her forehead. For some reason, even though she'd never seen the pirate captain be anything other than joyful and maybe a little dumb, she could feel the seriousness of his threat. However, as sad as it was, a part of her welcomed the thought of dying, of escaping the constant looks she had to cast over her shoulder, escaping the fear that she was the only person she'd ever be able to trust. "Lady?" Luffy questioned, eyes still trained on his crew. A sigh left the woman's mouth. "Fine." Mr. Blaze shot him a look from the corner of her eye and nodded as if asking to move, receiving a tentative nod in return. Her arms uncrossed and she slowly dropped them back down to her sides, the hands she'd created vanishing into a cloud of pink flower petals. The straw-hatted teen sighed a sigh of relief and let his legs unwrap from Ms. All Sunday's middle, dropping down to pull her hands behind her back. What? She was tall. He probably could have just stood on his toes, but that was no fun. He really hadn't even wanted to harm her, but if she had hurt his friends, she definitely probably would have died. "Hey, Nami!" he shouted to the group in front of them. "You got any rope?" The orange-haired girl quickly wiped away her shock at the turn of events and shook her head in the negative, making to walk in the direction of the Mary. "No, but I'm sure there's some on the ship. Gimme a sec." The rest of the group looked at each other for a moment before those who belonged to Luffy's crew began to make their way in his direction on the heels of their navigator. The other two, however, stayed exactly where they were. "She's dangerous," Vivi said from atop Karu's back, eyes meeting the woman she was referring to. "I would be careful around her, obviously." "So, this is the crew of the Straw Hat Pirates," Ms. All Sunday exclaimed, ignoring the princess's words in favor of getting a good look at those now surrounding her. "It's a pleasure to meet you all." She bowed her head in greeting. "I'm Ms. All Sunday, for those of you who don't know." "Ms. All Sunday, huh?" Sanji commented, eyes taking in the woman's form. She was stunning. He quickly brushed the thought away and looked back to her big blue eyes. "I'm assuming that means you're here for them?" he said, pointing his thumb over his shoulder. The woman focused in on the blonde boy who'd spoken, giving him a quick once-over. "You're a handsome one, aren't you?" The chef shuddered at the words, taking an involuntary step back as flashbacks from his night in Louch Town almost immediately floated through his mind at the way she'd said, "handsome." However, before he could take another step, something landed on his shoulder and he turned to find a blood-covered hand. "Answer the question," Zoro said thinly, bloody digits dropping from Sanji's shoulder to rest on the hilt of Kaguya. If the damn cook continued to make him feel any softer, he was gonna beat the shit out of him. "And pull yourself together, cook," he whispered in a low voice, "for God's sake. There seems to be a trend here, Mr. Black Fist," Ms. All Sunday commented, looking over her shoulder at the straw-hatted boy. "You've got quite the crew of lookers. Yourself included." Well, the long-nosed one wasn't really her type, but he was cute in his own special way. She shook her head and lightly laughed at the confused look he sent her, turning back to the others. "To answer your question, yes. I am here for those two. But, it seems as if things aren't quite going to plan." "Nami, you got that rope yet?" Luffy yelled up to the deck of the Mary. He was getting bored again. Hopefully, they could leave soon. He was ready for the next island. The Orange's feet slammed into the dock and she rushed back in the group's direction. "Yeah, I had to cut it down to the right length, but it should work just fine," she said, handing over the loop so Luffy could tie the woman's hands behind her back. She watched him for a moment before a stray thought made her speak up. "Wait, does tying her hands even stop her from using her devil fruit?" She didn't know for sure if that was what it was, but it seemed like the most likely explanation. What else could give you the power to grow hands wherever you wanted? Luffy stopped in his securing of the rope and sent his navigator a shrug before giving his final touches to the bindings, stepping back proudly when he finished. "Dunno. In all honesty, He had no idea if they would hold, but it looked good enough for him. "So, Mr. Black Fist," Ms. All Sunday said, turning to face the pirate captain once again. "What now?" A huff left Luffy's mouth. "Can you stop calling me that?" As cool as the title was, it wasn't his name. "My name's Luffy, pretty lady," he complained. The woman sent him a smirk and shrugged. "Well, if you must know, my name isn't pretty lady, as flattering as it is. So, when you start using my name, I'll start using yours." The boy groaned to himself. "Well then, can I call you something else?" he asked exasperatedly, another name almost immediately coming to mind. "How about Miss Sun?" Ms. All Sunday couldn't help the laugh that left her lips. "I think that name is a little too bright for someone like me," she countered. "I'm all for it," Zoro interjected, looking over his shoulder at Vivi and Igaram beginning to approach their group. "Less work for me." "I'm with Mosshead," Sanji added, almost immediately backtracking when he realized what he'd said. "Not that I would mind calling you by your name if that's what you prefer." Nami sighed to herself. She could already see where things were more than likely going to go. "Miss Sun works for me," she said, looking over to Usopp. "I honestly don't care," the sniper shivered to himself. "Just don't grow those hands on me again, please. Also, Luffy." The orange-haired girl's sweat dropped, pointing toward the blood beginning to dry on his chest. "Are those the birds?" The pirate captain sighed. "Yeah. We kinda fell and they didn't make it through the landing." He looked back up to the sky. "I only got the otter and the buzzard, though. The other one got away." "Other one?" Ms. All Sunday asked curiously. "As far as I'm aware, there are only 2 members of the Unluckies. And you seem to have killed them both." The clearance of a throat made the group stop in their conversation and turn toward the 2 now standing only a couple feet away from them. Igaram once again bowing his head. "Now that Ms. All Sunday is subdued, I would like to ask you once again to please take Vivi with you on your journey." They'd spent their time alone going over their plan and it all hinged on the pirates agreeing. "Please? There isn't much I can offer you except my utmost gratitude, but the princess is needed back in Alabasta," he practically begged. "1 billion berries," Nami countered, stepping up to the front of the group. "1 billion berries and you got a deal." If the severity of their situation was genuine and she really was a princess, then surely they could meet her demands. "Nami." Luffy groaned into the air. "I thought I was supposed to be the captain." The orange-it waved the pouting boy away. "Oh come on, Luffy. It's one extra person on the ship. Plus, we were probably going there at some point anyway. That's kinda how the log pose works." She turned back to the 2 in front of her and looked at them expectantly. "So? It's a billion or no deal." Igaram scrambled to find his voice. "I am but a humble servant of the Nefertaris. I couldn't possibly offer such a sou." "You have a deal," Vivi interrupted, nodding at her bodyguard when his wide eyes landed on her. "Get me back to Alabasta and you'll be given what you desire." The Straw Hats all eyed the woman skeptically. Well, everyone except for Luffy, who was sat with his knees clutched against his chest while he sulkily drew circles in the dirt. A moment of silence passed through the area as Nami stared at the blue-haired girl. She honestly doubted she was telling the truth. That being said, if they managed to get her back and she decided not to pay up, they could always just hold her for ransom. She shrugged to herself and turned to the rest of the crew. "Alright boys. Looks like we've got a new destination. Let's go ahead and get the ship ready. The log pose is set, so we can leave when we finish." Igaram sighed in relief and bowed to the pirate crew once again. "You have my gratitude, Straw Hat Pirates," he said genuinely. The panic running through him hidden behind was no way King Cobra would agree to giving them 1 billion berries. He shook his head and turned to Vivi and Karoo. "Problems to solve at a later date. Vivi, I am afraid this is where we must part ways," he said, holding out his hand as if asking for something. "I would ask that you give me the eternal pose to Alabasta." The words shocked the girl. What? Was he leaving? "But I thought we would be traveling together, Igaram," she replied in panic. If he wasn't coming with them, where was he going? "It's too dangerous, princess," he started, softly grabbing her hand in his. "One of us must make it back to tell your father of Mr. Zero's plans, and with all the attention we've garnered, I think it's best if we travel separately." Vivi hated that she could see the wisdom in his words and had to squeeze her eyes to make sure no tears came out. "Don't cry, princess. You will have Karoo and I'm certain we will see each other again upon your arrival in Alabasta." the blonde-haired man consoled. He looked into her watery eyes for a moment before she nodded and reached into her coat, pulling out the eternal pose and handing it over. Igaram gave her one last nod before turning back to the crew that would be traveling with the princess. I beg of you to please keep her safe and make it to Alabasta as quickly as you can. He bowed once again and without another word moved in the direction of the docks, toward a small ship that could likely only carry 4 to 5 people max. The Straw Hats watched the man board the vessel and pull in the anchor, the small craft almost immediately beginning to drift out into the open water. "Fear not, Princess Vivi," the man shouted from the deck, "we will see each other again soon." With his parting words said, the group watched Igaram sail out to the horizon for a moment before Luffy's voice snapped them into action. "Alright guys, let's get going," he said, waving those remaining toward the Mary. He paused when he realized that they would be traveling to a new island and excitement began to settle into his stomach. A welcome change from the boredom he'd felt most of the night. "If I may," Ms. All Sunday interjected, "I would suggest reaching into my coat." She smiled at the confused looks shot her way and nodded at the orange-haired girl she assumed was probably the navigator of the crew considering the log pose she wore on her wrist. "There's something in there I think you'll want for your journey." Nami eyed the woman before obliging her request, carefully reaching into her jacket to search for whatever it was she wanted them to have. She rustled around until her hand grasped something squishy. "I'm flattered, Ms. Navigator, and your hand feels quite nice, but I think what you're looking for is a little more to the right," the black-haired woman said like she hadn't just been fondled. Nami stared blankly at her for a moment before giving one last squeeze, this one out of respect more than anything else. "You're pretty stacked, Miss Sun," she turned back to her captain as soon as the words left her mouth and stopped him in his tracks. "Don't even say it, Luffy." The orangeade rolled her eyes at the laughter that burst from his throat and turned back to Miss Sun, the woman's small giggles making her smile. Without any more exploring, she listened to her instructions and gripped something hard when she moved to the innermost part of her coat. She pulled out of the purple clothing and what met her vision was something she'd already seen earlier in the night, albeit a different word written on the bottom. "That's an eternal pose to Alabasta and I would suggest following it rather than your log pose," Ms. All Sunday said, a hint of warning in her voice. "Your log pose will take you to the island closest to this one and you probably want to avoid it as it is quite, well, let's just say, interesting." Luffy walked over to the two while the other members of the crew made their way in the direction of the Mary and snatched the eternal pose from Nami's hand, peering at it intently. "So, what? This'll take us straight to Alamasta or whatever." The woman nodded her head in confirmation, softly laughing at his mispronunciation. "Yes, and it's a much easier route of travel than following your origin." The sound of shattering glass stopped her from finishing and she looked blankly at the crushed eternal pose as the pieces fell to the ground. "I'll take that as a no then." Luffy shrugged and clapped his hands together to rid them of the small shards of glass and wood. "Well, you said the next island was interesting, so I don't want to miss it." Nami sighed in exasperation. She should have expected that. She'd probably keep the other eternal pose she found to herself for the time being. She glanced over at Vivi and could see a slight bit of irritation on her face at the actions of her captain and, while she partially understood, she didn't really have any say in the matter. It was Luffy's ship. She was lucky they were even taking her in the first place. "Well, that settles that, I guess," Ms. All Sunday said, turning back toward Luffy. "It's been a pleasure, Mr. Luffy. But it seems as if it's time for you and your crew to be on your way." A groan left the boy's lips. "I told you, it's just Luffy," he replied before shooting her a confused look. "And what do you mean me and my crew? You're coming too?" Silence accompanied the words before it was broken by Nami. "Knew it." She sighed into the air, turning toward the ship to help the others get ready to leave. The black-haired woman stared blankly at the pirate captain and, for the first time in a long time, scrambled to find words. "What the hell do you mean she's coming with us, Luffy?" Vivi asked incredulously. How the hell was she supposed to travel with someone that could backstab her at any moment? Luffy shot her a look that said, "Keep talking and you stay here," and the girl stopped herself from saying any more. "Would you rather leave her here so she can tell old Croc exactly where you are and who you're with?" The words sufficiently cowed the girl and out of the corner of his eye the teen saw Ms. Sun regain her bearings, immediately stepping around her to stop her from saying anything more. "Nope. You're coming with us and, as good as you are at talking, nothing is gonna change my mind." He glanced over her shoulder as they moved in the direction of the ship, Vivi and Karoo in tow, and his eyes caught Levi and Nala still playing in the water. Plus, Levi and Nala seemed to really like each other.